Chapter 476. Of course, he would only kill those who resisted. He would not kill those who surrendered. Firstly, he did not want Lung Feng to become a cold-blooded killing machine. Secondly, the current development required a large number of people. This hole would be filled by conquering Jiaoji. With Yang Qindong's reiteration, all the officers understood what they had to do next. They immediately turned around and made their preparations. Yang Qindong did not forget to tell Hongjin, who was watching from the side, "You are from Jiaoji. If possible, you can do more of everyone's work. I will arrange a squad of soldiers to protect you from harm." "Thank you, Duke of Loyalty. Hongjin will do his best." Hongjin replied respectfully. After all, he was just an external general. He did not even have the right to address Yang Qindong as the sixth young master. He could only address him as Duke of Loyalty to show his allegiance. The sky was getting darker. Lung Feng, the auxiliary soldiers, and the temporary auxiliary soldiers had already rested and were making their own preparations. The next thing they needed to do was to wait until the time was up before they began to attack the city. It was not accurate to say that they were attacking the city. This was because at midnight, when many people had already fallen asleep, the south gate of Chu-Yi City was opened from the inside. Then, a bright torch circled the city gate 3 times. This was the signal to enter the city. It meant that Su Yunsheng and the scouts had taken control of the city gate. The Yang family troops, who were already prepared, entered the city in an orderly manner. After they carefully entered the city gate, they were led by the scouts, who were already prepared and rushed to their respective destinations. After entering the city, they went straight to their target. Everything was done in an orderly manner. Many people did not know that the army had entered the city. It was not until gunshots were heard from the granary where the military supplies were stored that the whole city became lively. Li Zhe was the general of Chu-Yi City, who had the bloodline of the Li family. While he was still lying on the big warm bed with a beauty lying beside him, the door of the bedroom was suddenly pushed open from the outside. This movement instantly woke him up, and he shouted loudly, "Who is it?" General, someone has broken into the city. Let's run." The ones who came were the guards of the general's mansion. To be able to become a general's bodyguard, they were naturally 1 in 100. Their vigilance had always been stronger than ordinary citizens and soldiers. When the city suddenly became chaotic, they felt that something was wrong. When they came out of the residence and came to the street, they vaguely saw an army approaching. They knew that it must be the enemy. After all, it was impossible for friendly forces to enter the city in the middle of the night without even saying hello. It was precisely because they knew that it might be the enemy that they rushed into the general's bedroom and shouted without regard for their status. Enemy? Where did the enemy come from? Li Zhe, who was still not fully awake, asked in confusion. But just as he finished speaking, before the guards could even open their mouths to explain, a very crisp gunshot suddenly rang out from the courtyard. The moment the gunshot rang out, the few people in the bedroom instantly felt their hair stand on end. They did not expect the enemy to break into the residence so quickly. Li Zhe, who was startled by the gunshot, was stunned for a moment. He did not ask any more questions and hurriedly put on the clothes he threw on the side of the bed. As he was putting on his clothes, he shouted, "What are you all standing there for? Hurry up and gather your men. Open up a bloody path for the general." Li Zhe was still shouting when the sounds of killing and gunshots outside were getting closer and closer. Just as he finished putting on his clothes and did not forget to hang his sword on his body, the guards outside the house started wailing one after another. As the only general's residence in the city, it was naturally the focus of attention. The ones carrying out this mission were Chunbo's troops from the 2nd Battalion of the 2nd Regiment of the Cold Vanguard. First, they completely surrounded the place. Then they broke down the door and entered the mansion. Once they entered, anyone who raised their weapons and refused to surrender, regardless of who they were, whether they were male or female, old or young, they were all shot to death. The 95 style continued to spew out tongues of fire in the night. Soon, the number of Jiaoji soldiers who fell under the muzzle of their guns increased to 100. Under the waves of gunshots, the people finally became obedient. They knew that the people who came were not joking with them. Some of the more courageous ones who were afraid of death threw their weapons to the ground and squatted on the ground obediently, becoming captives. After a series of gunshots outside the door, a few tall figures rushed into the bedroom and saw General Li Jia trembling all over. Li Jia was only promoted because of his family's connections. He had never fought a proper battle before. How could he have seen such a scene? Seeing the guard who reported the situation to him just now lying in front of him covered in blood, his mind was completely blank. He did not know what to do. Remove his weapon. Although the cold vanguard did not know Li Jia and did not know what he looked like, they could tell that he was a big fish just by looking at his clothes. The squad leader who rushed in immediately grabbed Li Jia's sword and pressed him to the ground. Following the capture of Li Jia and the capture of the general's residence, the entire Chu-Yi city basically gave up all resistance. From the beginning to the end, it only took 3 hours to take control of the city. When Yang Qindong entered Chu-Yi city under the protection of the 1st and 2nd guards, the city had already been completely taken over. Other than the Yang family soldiers who were cleaning up the bloodstains and corpses on the streets, there was only one soldier who was standing guard 20 meters away. Luo had also brought a group of officers to wait for Yang Qindong. When he saw the 6th young master coming over, he jogged forward to report the results of the battle. Reporting to the 6th young master, the entire Chu-Yi city is already under our control. Right now, the 4 gates are tightly shut. Without orders, no one can leave. The general of Chu-Yi city, Li Jia, has also been captured alive by us and is now being locked up in their residence. In this battle, we have killed approximately 1,300 people who resisted and seized all kinds of military resources. Listening to Luo Po's report, Yang Qindong nodded from time to time. After the other party finished, he said happily, "Very good. You have done well. Your military achievements will be recorded, and you will be rewarded according to your contributions. By the way, how are our casualties?" Reporting to the 6th young master, "We only injured a dozen temporary auxiliary soldiers. No one died in the battle." When he said this, Luo Po was still very excited. Not bad. Hearing that there were no soldiers who died in the battle, Yang Qindong's face flashed with obvious satisfaction. Nowadays, the soldiers were more and more able to keep up with the rhythm of the war. During the battle in the forest of Langsun, more than 20 auxiliary soldiers and temporary auxiliary soldiers were killed or injured. To be able to win this battle with 0 casualties was enough to make people feel gratified. Seeing that Yang Qindong was in a good mood, Political Commissar Kong Jia, who was standing at the side, hesitated for a moment before taking a small step forward to report. 6th young master, we have found many Han people in the city. They are not living well. Many of them don't even have clothes to cover their bodies. What do you want to do with them? Yang Qindong's originally gratified and happy expression completely disappeared at this moment. He thought that the Han people in the outside world would not be living well, but it was out of his expectations that they could not even wear clothes. How many people are there? Yang Qindong's voice sounded in a low voice. We have roughly calculated there are about 1,000 people. There should be some that we have not found yet. After all, this time, their main objective was to attack and occupy the city. They really did not have much time to observe other things. Where are they? Bring me to them. When Yang Qindong heard that there were so many people and that not all of them were found, his frown deepened. According to Hong Jin and the information sent by the Security Bureau, Chu-E City was not very busy. Even the entire population of the city was only 20 to 30,000 people, and this was in addition to the 2,000 city guards. However, there were more than 1,000 people who were captured. Wouldn't that be 20 to 30% of the total population? It was definitely not a small number. Yang Qindong wanted to take a look at the captured Han people. Kong Jia originally wanted to stop him, but he thought that there were some things that should be seen clearly by the young master. This would be of great help to the sixth young master. He nodded and led the way. Under the protection of a group of Lung Feng, Yang Qindong turned 2 corners and arrived in front of a large courtyard. Looking at the courtyard, he knew that this was the place where the Han people gathered. Kong Jia was extremely meticulous with his arrangements. By placing the Han people here, he could prevent them from being harmed by the other Jiaoji people. When they arrived at the entrance of the courtyard, Political Commissar Kong Jia's footsteps were obviously heavy. He turned back and looked at Yang Qindong and said, "Sixth young master, you have to be mentally prepared." "Go in, I am ready." Yang Qindong's expression did not change. In his previous life, he had completed a mission in the war-torn lands of Africa. What kind of people had he not seen before? Although Yang Qindong thought that he had seen a lot, when he really entered the courtyard and saw the Han people sitting around the bonfire, his strong spirit was greatly shaken. What he saw could no longer be considered as humans. If he had to compare them, they were like apes that had not fully evolved. Yes, they were weak and skinny. They were as thin as firewood, and their eyes were wide open. They were looking at Yang Qindong and his group with fear. These people were generally not tall, and some of the adults were obviously hunched over. This was clearly the side effect of working hard for a long time, and their bodies could not bear the burden. There were also some old people who not only had dark skin, but their bodies were also extremely thin and weak. Looking at the small half of their arms that were exposed when they put on the unsuitable clothes that they had found from God knows where, they were probably not much thicker than a 6 or 7-year-old child. Chapter 477. There were also a small number of children. They were extremely thin and weak. At a glance, one could tell that they were malnourished and their body proportions were severely out of balance. There was also a young man who looked like he was 6 or 7 years old. He weighed less than 15 kilograms. His large head formed a stark contrast with his small body. If there was a video camera here, if this scene could be recorded and shown to the other Han people, the women would cry nonstop, and even the men would feel very uncomfortable. Just like the group of people standing beside Yang Qindong. Many of them had tears in their eyes. Some of them even had bloodshot eyes. They looked as if they were about to kill someone. These Jiaoji people deserved to be hacked to death. Tiger's mane was very close to Yang Qindong. Others might have considered the presence of the sixth young master and would hesitate to say something. However, Tiger's mane did not need to. He directly said what was on his mind. With him taking the lead, the other people immediately followed suit. They were all cursing the Jiaoji people. Some even scolded the great Ming dynasty. These people were all kidnapped by the Jiaoji people. To think that they kept saying that the world was peaceful and the people were rich. If that was the case, why didn't they save their own people? To let them suffer here, was this something a great country would do? Yang Qindong was also in a bad mood. However, he knew that similar things did not only happen in Jiaoji, but also in other small countries. Not all Han people were respected, and not all Han people lived with dignity. It was just like the memories in his mind. The status of the Asians in the future was not high. They even felt inferior to the Asians. They felt that they could not compare to the Europeans. Even if the country was strong, This mentality was still in the hearts of many people. It was precisely because the country was not strong enough that it was impossible to talk about fairness in many things, whether it was in the military, science and technology, or business and agriculture. This could be especially reflected. However, since he was blessed by the heavens and came to this world and brought along the most powerful Tsang, Yang Qindong was determined to change this fate and situation. What he wanted was that no matter where he went in the future, as long as he said that he was a Han, people would look up to him. As long as he said that he was a Han, people would not have any thoughts of bullying him. On the contrary, they should be the ones feeling inferior. For this goal, Yang Qindong was willing to fight for the rest of his life, even if it was destined to be a long process. Give them enough food and clothing, then invite them to the largest square in the city tomorrow morning. Yang Qindong gritted his teeth as he finished speaking. Then he turned around and left. Clearly, he was unwilling to stay in such an environment for even a moment longer. It wasn't that he despised these poor Han people, but he was afraid that he wouldn't be able to stop himself from slaughtering all the Jiaoji people in the city. Behind him was a group of Lung Feng's higher-ups and guards. Compared to when they first arrived, their expressions were solemn and even frighteningly cold. A ruthless aura was naturally emitted from their bodies. Even after they left the courtyard and arrived at the main street, the auxiliary soldiers and temporary soldiers in charge of guarding the place could still clearly feel a monstrous killing intent. In the past, some of the officers of Lung Feng felt that it was inhumane for the sixth young master to want to exterminate Jiaoji. After all, the influence of the doctrine of the Golden Mean over the years wasn't ineffective. They were particular about harmony and wealth, about not leaving a line for others so that they could meet again. They were particular about being merciful and forgiving, and about winning people over with virtue. However, when they saw the scene of the Han people living in the city, their thoughts changed and were shaken. Since others didn't treat the Han people as humans, then don't blame the Han people for not treating you as humans. You brought this upon yourselves. Since you committed this sin, then you have to pay for it yourself. And such thoughts were constantly accumulating. Slowly, it would form a huge doubt that would eventually explode. The next morning, the meeting at the largest plaza in Chui City was the trigger point that Yang Qindong prepared for everyone. It wasn't enough for him to prosper the Han people alone. He needed the support and approval of more people. Although he could use his authority to force Lung Feng to do so, there was still a hint of coercion in the end. It wasn't something that everyone was willing to do. This would make it hard for things to be handled and carried out at a lower level. Yang Qindong hoped that he wasn't the only one who saw this point. Others would also see this point and willingly submit to him. That way, he would be able to achieve twice the result with half the effort. Under Yang Qindong's orders, all the civilians and captured soldiers in Chui City were rushed to the plaza the next day. When they arrived, a temporary wooden platform had already been set up. In the center of the plaza, there were a few huge wooden pillars with people tied up. Any civilian who had lived in this city before could recognize that the person tied up in the middle of the wooden pillars was General Chu Li Zhe. As a member of the Li family, Li Zhe had been tyrannical ever since he came to Chui City. Not only would he bully the Han people, he would also oppress the Jiaoji civilians as much as possible. This caused his reputation to be very bad. However, who asked him to be a member of the Li family? Most people were angry but didn't dare to say anything. So when they saw him tied up there, many people, including many Jiaoji civilians, were very happy. This was what they meant by those who commit too much injustice will bring about their own destruction. If one day you separated yourself from the people and always put yourself on a pedestal, then the day you fall would not be far away. The person tied up in the middle was Li Zhe. On his two sides were his loyal subordinates and some black-hearted merchants in the city. It was precisely because of their protection that the common people's lives were so miserable and grievances could be heard everywhere. Because of this, even though there were more than 30,000 people in Jiaoji near the plaza, there wasn't much chaos. This made some of the officers who went to the courtyard last night feel like they couldn't vent their anger. More and more people gathered. Even some Jiaoji soldiers were brought here. Compared to the civilians, who were still relatively free, they were much more miserable. There were 20 people tied up on a rope. They were brought here, with their bodies pressed against each other. It was as if they were wearing candied haws on a stick. Behave yourselves. Kill anyone who doesn't behave. The Lung Feng soldiers who were watching over them spoke with ferocious expressions, causing the Jiaoji soldiers who had witnessed their might to become extremely obedient. Even when they saw their general tied up on a wooden pillar, not a single one of them had any intention of stepping forward. Compared to the state of these captives, the treatment of the 2,000 Han commoners was much better. They could stand near the nearest wooden stake and even eat the breakfast given by the army while gesturing with their fingers. They appeared to be very comfortable and relaxed. That's right. After the night, when the count of Han people started in the morning, there were a few hundred more people. There were a total of 2,000 Han people. These people spent the night in apprehension, even though they knew that Tsui City had changed hands and that it was very likely that the Ming army was coming. They didn't dare to take the initiative to step forward. After all, the Ming army was the Ming army, who said that they would definitely stand up for them. It was only this morning that more of the villagers found them and told them about how they had been treated the previous night. They had food, drinks, and even a good night's sleep. Only then did everyone start to believe them. More people started to come out. Now they gathered together and wanted to see what these Han soldiers who claimed that they weren't part of the Ming army were going to do. Under the watchful eyes of everyone, Yang Qindong appeared on the platform under the protection of the guards. This uniform was custom-made by the clothing factory in Qiqian City. It was different from the one Yang Qindong wore during the military parade. This time, it was golden in color. The golden threads sewn on it were all real, causing it to be several times heavier than normal clothes. Naturally, when it was worn, it shone with a golden light and looked very beautiful. In the eyes of the old men in Qiqian, the sixth young master was their sky, their king, and their emperor. Naturally, he was worthy of wearing such a uniform. Perhaps this was the thinking of the feudal society. Since he was the only emperor and king, he must wear gold to show it. If it wasn't for Yang Qindong's firm resistance, he was afraid that a golden dragon would be embroidered on the uniform. Thinking about it, this uniform was really no different from an emperor's robe. It could be seen how much these people hoped that Yang Qindong could become the emperor and lead them forward. Now, this golden robe was empty on his body. After borrowing the style of the commander's uniform, it made the young man's heroic figure appear even more upright. When he appeared, his superior aura naturally manifested, causing the originally noisy square to immediately quiet down. This was exactly what Yang Qindong wanted to see. As he stretched his hand behind him, Beta Persei arrogantly brought out a loudspeaker that he had specially rushed out last night. This could play a better role in amplifying the sound. Holding the loudspeaker in his hand, Yang Qindong looked at the more than 40,000 soldiers in the square. He felt extremely excited and shouted majestically, "Long live Lung Feng! Long live the auxiliary soldiers! Long live the temporary auxiliary soldiers! Long live, long live, long live!" After a moment of silence, the sound of an earth-shattering echo echoed. Although shouting, "Long live" here, there was no emperor appearing, and it was a bit out of place, but it was undeniable that this shout stirred up the atmosphere of the more than 10,000 soldiers. Chapter 478. The excited shouts seemed to be contagious, causing many citizens of Jiaoji to have the urge to shout as well. This was human nature. Most of the time, things had nothing to do with them. However, when the people around them were doing the same, they would follow suit. There was no need to ask why, because there was no reason at all. After more than a dozen shouts, Yang Qindong once again placed the megaphone by his mouth. The crowd suddenly quieted down. It was so uniform that it created a huge psychological pressure. This kind of pressure was something that those who had never experienced personally would never be able to experience. Brave warriors, with your combined efforts, we have finally stepped into the Jiaoji nation today. Chu East City is the first city that we have conquered, but it will definitely not be the last. It will not be long before we set foot on this entire nation and completely trample them under our feet. Long live, long live! As soon as his voice fell, tens of thousands of people shouted in unison, shaking the eardrums of everyone present. The megaphone was raised again, and the sound was suppressed. Then Yang Qindong looked at the crowd and began his speech for the day. The rise and fall of the nation is the responsibility of every man. In the long river of history, there are countless heroic deeds. Patriotic figures are shining like stars. During the Warring States period, there was the great patriotic poet Chu Yuan, the national hero Yu Fei, Wen Tianxiang, and so on. They were loyal to the motherland and loved the people. They were not afraid of demotion or sacrifice. They were loyal to the nation and loved the people. They were not afraid of demotion or sacrifice. However, today, I do not wish to talk about how glorious we were in the past, nor do I wish to talk about how great the ancients were, because right in front of us are our fellow countrymen who have been victimized. Everyone, please take a look at them now. Do they have any pride as Han people? Could it be that when you look at them, you can feel the pride of being a soldier? As he spoke, Yang Qindong pointed at the 2,000 Han people in front of him. Most of them had already put on new clothes with the help of lung foam. At the very least, they could cover their skin and prevent it from being exposed. But those clothes were obviously new, and they didn't fit her at all. Moreover, even if she was wearing clothes, it still couldn't prevent everyone from seeing her thin body underneath. Their emaciated faces were telling everyone that they were not doing well at all. Just as everyone was looking at the 2,000 Hans with their own thoughts, Yang Qindong's voice sounded out once more. No, this is our disgrace. Every day, we proclaim that the world is peaceful and prosperous, but we can't even guarantee the safety and lives of our own people. How can the grand, great Ming dynasty have the face to say that? If I must say, they are not fit for the job. They are unqualified. They took the taxes that the people worked hard to pay for nothing. They let the people place their hopes on them for nothing. They became rulers for nothing. They are incompetent. If they can't even protect their own people, how can they talk about peace and prosperity? How can they talk about being a great country? How can they talk about caring for the world? What's even more hateful is that every time a country comes to the capital to pay respects to the emperor, they still have the face to take out large amounts of gold and silver and give them back. They even say that they are friends for generations and that this is the style of a great country. If we let them see the situation of our own people outside, I wonder if they will feel ashamed. Perhaps, perhaps not. However, we cannot place our hopes on them anymore. Since they are sitting in their high positions and not doing anything, then let's get out of the way and let those who are willing to do the work. And we are the people who are willing to do the work. At the very least, with our hard work, we will be able to let more of our own people live better and more dignified lives. At the very least, with our hard work, we will not be bullied or treated unfairly by others. At the very least, with our hard work, the Han people will become the true rulers of the world. Any kind people who want to be on good terms with the Han people will also be able to live a good life. When Yang Qindong spoke up to this point, he had already revealed his ambition. It was as if he did not put the great Ming dynasty in his eyes. However, the Yang family soldiers did not feel that there was anything wrong. In their opinion, no one was stronger than their sixth young master. Since that was the case, it would be best for the sixth young master to lead them. As for those who objected, they would have to experience the power of the guns in their hands. Even if you were made of iron, you would still be blasted into a sieve. Yang Qindong's speech continued. When he talked about personal dignity, he pointed at the Lung Feng brothers who were maintaining order and said, "They are the greatest army. What others can't do, they can do. What others can't think of, they can think of. In the future, with them around, we, the Han people, will become the strongest and most unique people in the world. No matter where we go, we will be respected by others. All the things that others have forced on us in the past, we will take it back 10 times, 100 times, 1,000 times. Today, we will start with the enemies in Chui City, who are hostile to the Han people. Men, bring down the daggers." Under Yang Qindong's shout, a company of 100 Lung Feng soldiers each carried a plate out. On each plate, there was a dagger. There were a total of 1,000 daggers. This was the gift that Yang Qindong had prepared for the Han people. Didn't the ancients say that those who were evil to the core deserved to be stabbed 1,000 times? Well then, today was the real version. After the daggers were taken down, Yang Qindong looked at the 2,000 Han people with an encouraging gaze. "Next, we will read out the crimes. After you are convicted, you can take revenge. There are 1,000 daggers here. 1,000 of you can take them and cut the bodies of those who have bullied you in the past. Believe me, no one will convict you. Your actions are completely legal and reasonable. However, do you dare to do so?" At the end of his speech, Yang Qindong's tone had become a kind of questioning, but more importantly, he was still guiding them. After being questioned by Yang Qindong, the 2,000 Han people who originally thought that they were here to watch the show were at a loss for words. These people were used to being bullied and treated like humans. Some of them were even born like this. Ever since they could understand things, there was a thought that told them that they were the most lowly people and deserved to be bullied like cattle or horses. Now that there was a possibility that this might change, of course, they would feel uncomfortable. The 2,000 people looked at each other. The children looked at the adults, and the adults looked at the elderly. No one made a decision immediately. "What? You don't even have the courage to take revenge on your enemies?" Yang Qindong had long expected this scene. After all, many years of habits were not something that could be easily changed. However, when he saw that these people were still so hesitant despite his support, he was somewhat disappointed. Yang Qindong was disappointed. Because of this, there was a sense of loss in his eyes. This scene was seen by the 2,000 people. Although they had only known each other for a short time, at most, it was only the second time that they had met. However, they could truly feel that this seemingly powerful young man was biased towards them. Everything that he did was for their own good. Since he was doing it for their own good, they could not let such a good person down. With this thought in mind, 2 middle-aged men in the crowd finally responded. However, because of the years of oppression, they were still a little timid. Even when they responded to Yang Qindong, their voices were not very loud. If the sixth young master had not been staring at these people, he would not have been able to hear what they were saying. "We dare." "You what?" Seeing that someone finally took the initiative to step forward, Yang Qindong stared at the 2 men with encouraging eyes. As if infected by Yang Qindong's emotions, the 2 men first looked at each other, and then their tone became firmer. We dare to take these daggers to take revenge on our enemies. Good. Beta Persei, send the daggers to the two of them. Yang Chendong immediately agreed, and Beta Persei quickly took 2 daggers and sent them to the 2 men. When the 2 of them really held a dagger in their trembling hands, this scene deeply stimulated the others behind them. Immediately, the men and women who also said they dared to step forward. It was only 1,000 daggers, and they were quickly distributed. Some of the children wanted to have a dagger, but it was already gone. This was because Yang Chendong considered that they were still young and did not want to do it personally. He did not want to leave any bad memories in their hearts. Therefore, he only took out 1,000 daggers. With these 1,000 daggers and the protection of the strong lung feng, these Han people who had been bullied for many years finally had the courage to rush to the wooden platform and cut Li Zhi's body with their daggers. Instead of stabbing, they cut. This was to end Li Zhi's life by 1,000 cuts. It had to be said that this method was a bit cruel. This could be distinguished from his wailing and howling, but at the same time, it was also a way to vent their hatred. This could be seen from the faces of the people who waved their daggers. Not only did they vent their anger, but they also took the opportunity to hold their heads high. Their courage seemed to have increased a lot at this moment, and confidence shrouded them. Chapter 479. In the following period of time, Li Zhi was not the only one who enjoyed such treatment. The other influential people in Chui City who were tied up with him also enjoyed the treatment. Their status and identity were mostly obtained by oppressing the Han people. Now, it was time for them to reap the benefits. The screams on the small platform became louder and louder, causing the people of Jiaoji, who were forced to watch the execution, to feel their scalps go numb. Because of this, there was some chaos. Some people even wanted to take the opportunity to resist and instigate others to attack the mercenaries. Since they were already prepared, the sharpshooters of the cold front quickly found the troublemakers. The sound of the 95 style was heard from afar. After killing dozens of leaders, the chaotic scene was completely suppressed. After seeing the soldiers shoot and kill without any explanation, everyone became more obedient for the sake of their own lives. Although they became obedient, it did not mean that they would be let off. As the next step was carried out, under the testimony of the Han people, the people of Jiaoji who had bullied them were pulled out from the crowd one by one. Then, they would be put on public trial based on the mistakes they had made. Those who were too vicious were beheaded on the spot. Those who did not commit too serious of a crime were sentenced to a term of imprisonment and would be brought to Qiqian City in the future. As more and more people from Jiaoji were brought out, some of the other people were regretting it, while some were rejoicing. Those who regretted it were those who had mistreated the Han people. They were thinking that if they had been kind back then, they would not have to be punished so severely now. It seemed that it was better to be kind to others. Fortunately, there were kind-hearted lords who treated the Han people well. Now, they did not have to worry about being accused by others. All they had to do was to live their lives well. The series of activities of testifying, arresting, public trial, and sentencing lasted from morning to night. However, it was still not completed. According to Yang Chendong, such a public trial would take another day. This was because there were not many people in Chui City. If there were more people, it would take 7 days and 7 nights to finish the trial, just like in Hanoi City, the capital of Jiaoji. The public trial would continue tomorrow, and it was necessary to eliminate the unstable elements in the city once and for all. At the same time, it was necessary to build up the confidence of the 2,000 Han people. After all, for a period of time, there were some matters that required their help to complete. However, these were no longer important. Under the suppression of the armed forces, the citizens of Jiaoji in the city could no longer cause any trouble. What Yang Qindong needed to consider was what Jiaoji would do after he conquered Chui City and how he should deal with it. Fortunately, the communication system was not advanced. Even if something happened in the city, it would not spread immediately. In other words, Yang Qindong and his men still had time to make all the necessary preparations. After summoning the officers under him, Yang Qindong began to make arrangements in an orderly manner. After an hour, the officers walked out of the barracks. Some of them had satisfied smiles on their faces, just like Chunbo, the commander of the 2nd Battalion of the 2nd Regiment of the Cold Front. There were also some officers who looked dejected. It was obvious that their unit was not the main attacker. If they were not the main attacker, they would not be able to make great contributions. It was no wonder that their expressions were ugly. The one with the ugliest expression was King Lily of Jiaoji, who had just received the news. On the afternoon of the 2nd day after Chui City was conquered, old Lily, who was in his 60s and taking an afternoon nap with his concubine, was woken up by his subordinates. While he was still looking displeased, as if he would punish his subordinates for disturbing him if it wasn't something important, a piece of news made him turn pale with fright. "Your Majesty, there is news from the rear. Chui City has been conquered by the mercenaries." Lily, who was not fully awake yet, widened his eyes when he heard this. Then he acted as if he did not hear it clearly and asked, "What did you say? Say it again." Prime Minister Yuan Chunqing of Jiaoji knew that it was not that the king did not hear it clearly, but that he did not want to believe it. He had no choice but to repeat the incident of Chui City being conquered. This time, Lily heard it clearly. His brain was working at high speed, and his eyeballs were moving in fear. After a while, he asked, "Have you found out who did it?" "Your Majesty, we have not found out. However, I think it has a lot to do with the mercenaries." Yuan Chunqing guessed. Mercenaries? Weren't they surrounded by Wang Gengwang and Chen Heijin? Where did they find the troops to attack Chui City? Lily shook his head as he spoke. Obviously, he did not believe that the mercenaries were so powerful. Therefore, he added, "Could it be the Southern Ming army? After all, they thought that we killed their envoy. It is normal for them to seek revenge." "Absolutely not." At this moment, Yuan Chunqing said confidently. Then he explained, "Your Majesty, we have arranged our own people in the Southern Ming army. If they do anything, they will not be able to hide it from our eyes. Moreover, the Southern Ming's opponent is the king of Min Zhuang. Before this disaster is dealt with, how could they divide their troops to deal with us?" Lily nodded after hearing Yuan Chunqing's words. He knew that he still looked down on the mercenaries. If that was the case, it seemed that only this mysterious army could make a move on them. However, no matter how mysterious he was still a human. Li strode to the map of the palace and stood there for a moment before he gave the order. Order Jishu, Beibei, and Longbian cities to send troops to attack Chui City from different directions. Try to get rid of the invading mercenaries in the city in the shortest time possible. Also, send someone to contact Chen Heijin and Wang Gengwang. Tell them that we have discovered the main force of the mercenaries here. Tell them to advance boldly and get rid of the enemy as soon as possible. Lily might be old, but he still had a thorough understanding of the situation in Jiaoji. The series of countermeasures he adopted were also very appropriate. Prime Minister Yuan Chunqing, who was standing below, nodded. If he was the one making the arrangements, this was the most he could do. He immediately complied and walked out of the room. When King Lily was the only one left, his eyes flashed with anger and killing intent. "Mercenaries, since you took the initiative to find trouble with me, then don't go back." Humph. Jiaoji was not very big. the advantage of a small country was that things could be spread quickly as scouts on horses left the city and headed in different directions. A net was formed to deal with the mercenaries. Beibei City. It was located on the east side of Hanoi, the capital of Jiaozhi. It could be said that it was the eastern gate of the capital. Since it was the eastern gate, its location was naturally very important. To be able to become the general guarding the city, he naturally had some authority. He was Pan Wenfei of the Pan family, one of the 6 great families of Jiaozhi. Relying on his family's prestige, Pan Wenfei obtained this position. Because of this matter, who knew how many people had talked about him behind his back? He did not know when it started, but he had secretly made up his mind to perform well. When he achieved great merit, he would use facts to slap the faces of those who dared to slander him behind his back. He would let them know that they were wrong. However, many times having the intention was one thing, and being able to do it was another. If he wanted to achieve great merit, he had to have the opportunity. Previously, when King Lily was persuaded to send troops to the southern Ming Empire, Pan Wenfei had fought to bring troops north. However, how could the Pan family compete with the Yuan family? In the end, he failed. After returning to Beibei City, he could only continue to wait. However, although Beibei City was known as the Eastern Gate of Hanoi, the southern Ming Empire was currently weak. It seemed that it was impossible for them to attack Jiaozhi's territory. He did not know where his opportunity was, and if it would appear again. This was especially so when he received news that Wang Gengwang's army was progressing smoothly, and he had already captured 50,000 Han soldiers. This made his heart itch even more, and he cursed Wang Gengwang countless times in his heart, jealous of his good luck. Fortunately, some time ago, news suddenly came from the front, saying that an army called the Mercenary Army had suddenly appeared and fought with Wang Gengwang. Wang Gengwang's nephew, Wang Yongyang, had died on the battlefield. When he received the news, Pan Wenfei's heart was filled with joy. Although they were officials of the same court, there was still a difference in seniority. If Wang Gengwang could not do it, would it be his turn? It was also from that time that he began to train the army, preparing to replace Wang Gengwang and go to the front lines at any time. However, what he did not expect was that before Wang Gengwang's news came, Chu-Yi City to his east had suddenly changed hands. When this news came out, it gave him a big fright. After sending people to pass the news to Hanoi City, Pan Wenfei began to prepare to send troops. Speaking of which, Chu-Yi City was the closest to him. Now that he had the opportunity to send troops, no one would fight with him. Didn't that mean that it was time for him to display his strength? As long as he eliminated the enemy from the east, he would definitely attract the attention of the king. In the future, it would not be difficult for him to get promoted and become rich. The more he thought about it, the more excited Pan Wenfei became. In a very short time, he began to gather the troops and mobilize the military supplies. He could not wait to perform well. Sure enough, in less than a day, King Li's order was passed down, allowing North Belt City to send troops to Chu-Yi City. At the same time, they would take back Chu-Yi City and eliminate the invading enemies. Chapter 480. Who was the enemy? The imperial edict did not state it clearly. However, to Pan Wenfei, none of this was important. What was important was that he could finally lead an army into battle. He had envied his elders for being able to gallop on the battlefield countless times. The moment he received the order, he gathered the 2,000 Jiaozhi soldiers who were on standby and left the city. It was not that Pan Wenfei did not want to bring more soldiers out of the city, but he could only mobilize these 2,000 men. With the mentality of going all out in battle, not a single soldier was left in the city. All of them followed him out of the city and headed straight for Chu-Yi City in the east. At the same time when Pan Wenfei left the city, the armies of Jishu and Longbin cities also began to gather rapidly and set off towards Chu-Yi City 6 hours later. The only difference was that they only brought 1,000 soldiers and left half of their soldiers to guard the city. The 3 northern cities moved, and the scouts who had been staring at them quickly reported the information to Chu-Yi City's Yang Chendong. Seeing that the fish had taken the bait, Yang Chendong, who was facing the 3 armies, was not afraid at all. On the contrary, he laughed out loud. Very good, especially the North Belt City General Pan Wenfei's performance. It seems like you are quite accurate in judging people, Hong Jin. Yang Chendong laughed out loud. Hong Jin, who was standing respectfully at the side, lowered his head and replied embarrassedly, I was just lucky to have guessed correctly. It is still the Duke of Loyal and Courageous who gained from strategizing. Previously, Yang Chendong had listened to Hong Jin's analysis of the characters of some of the Jiaoji generals. When he talked about Pan Wenfei, he said that this person was a person who rejoiced in grandiose achievements. He always liked to talk about strategy on paper when he had nothing to do. Because of this, many people had laughed at him. He had never been on the battlefield and thought that he could win the war by manipulating the map. What was the difference between this and deceiving oneself? However, Pan Wenfei only thought that others laughed at him out of jealousy and did not listen to advice at all. As one of the generals, Hong Jin naturally knew about this matter. He reported the matter and proposed that once he learned that Cord City was easily occupied, Pan Wenfei would play his armchair strategist. It was very likely that he would mobilize the entire army and reveal a great flaw. Yang Chendong attached great importance to Hong Jin's words. Furthermore, in his opinion, it was fine even if the information was inaccurate. To be honest, he didn't think much of the 1,200 Jiaoji soldiers. Sending out a cold front battalion or even an auxiliary battalion to deal with them would be a piece of cake. With such confidence, Yang Chendong followed Xian Hongjin's plan and arranged for Battalion Commander Chen Bo of Lungfeng to lie in ambush on the road between Beidao City and Chu-Yi City. He was only waiting for the enemy to come out in full force so that he could seize the opportunity to seize the city. Now, it seemed that this arrangement was very correct. After praising Hong Jin, Yang Chendong turned to the other officers and said, since the enemy has made their move, we should also prepare for action. Follow plan number 1 and enter the battlefield. Yes. After the officers saluted in unison, they began to get busy with their own tasks. At this moment, King Lily of Jiaoji had no idea what kind of powerful opponent they were facing this time. Even the enemy had started to move. The Jiaoji army that had been peaceful for over 20 years was now in a state of turmoil and war. The distance between Beidao City and Chu-Yi City was only about 180 li. Even if the road was uneven and they had to take a detour, it was only about 200 li. In Pan Wenfei's opinion, this distance could be covered in 3 days. In terms of leg strength, the Ming army was more than twice as fast as the Jiaoji army. Perhaps it was because they had lived in the mountains since young. Many of them had trained their feet to be as sturdy as iron. Even if they were only wearing cloth shoes, their walking speed was still not slow. They could cover about 70 li in a day. In addition, the weather was perfect. It was still drizzling a while ago, but in the past 2 days, the weather had completely cleared up. The weather was so good, the roads were drier, and the army moved faster and faster. All of this created an illusion for Pan Wenfei that this was the will of the heavens, allowing him to reach Chu-Yi City faster and achieve the first military victory. The speed of Beifeng's army was already very fast. However, compared to the 2 battalions led by Battalion Commander Chen Bo and the 2 auxiliary battalions, it was still much slower. Once there was no battle, The Lung Feng's usual training was 10 kilometers in the morning and 10 kilometers in the morning. If the weather was good in the afternoon, they would even do a 5 kilometers warm-up. Under such high-intensity training, no one could compare to him in terms of speed. To the Lung Feng, it was normal for them to cover a distance of 100 kilometers in a day. If the situation was urgent, they could move even faster. Only by knowing yourself and your enemy can you win 100 battles. They did not understand the mercenaries at all. They did not even dare to confirm whether the ones who took down Chuyi City were mercenaries. The fate of the Jiaoji army seemed to have been decided. Needless to say, Beatty City had already been taken down by Yang Chendong. How could their defeat not be decided? Just like now, when the sky darkened, Chunbo led his 3 battalions of Yang family army to quietly pass by the other side of the mountain range. This kind of irregular movement left Pan Wunfei completely in the dark. He didn't know that his old nest, Beidai City, was about to face the consequence of changing its surname, and he was destined to become a lone army, an army that would never return. In Chuyi City, Yang Chendong was having dinner with 2,000 Han people. The trial conference had ended yesterday. Those who had mistreated the Han people in Chuyi City in the past, regardless of whether they were soldiers or civilians, had all received their due retribution. This left Chuyi City, which originally had a population of 30,000, with only 25,000 people left. A total of 2,000 people were killed and 3,000 were sentenced to death. The entire city was filled with the smell of blood. Even the number of Jiaoji citizens walking on the streets had decreased significantly. Even though the number of people had decreased, the atmosphere in the city had become better. The evil people had all been killed, leaving only the kind-hearted ones. When they met, they would nod their heads to show their friendliness, which lessened the killing intent. In particular, the Yang clan army had never bullied anyone. As long as one abided by the law, even if one bumped into them on the streets, they would not interfere with one another. This made the remaining 20,000 Jiaoji citizens feel much more at ease. In addition, Yang Chendong had ordered the Yang clan army to open up the treasury of Chuyi City and distribute the stored food to the citizens on time. This solved the problem of their food supply, and the atmosphere in the city became much more harmonious. Speaking of which, Jiaoji used to be a subordinate of the great Ming dynasty, so the citizens did not have a strong sense of conflict. In addition, Yang Chendong had the intention of running this place well. In just 2 days, the security in the city had improved. Setting himself as an example, Yang Chendong would come to eat with the Han people whenever it was time to eat, under the influence of the good atmosphere. Not only did the Han people feel warm, even some of the more daring citizens of Jiaoji dared to come over and take a look at the young demon king, who had killed people without batting an eyelid 2 days ago. Tonight, Yang Chendong came to the square to eat with the Han people again, deepening the relationship between both parties. In fact, since yesterday, there were no more than 2,000 Han people gathered here. Under the busy work of Kong Jia and Song Zhe, the 2 political commissars, the houses of the Jiaoji villains who had been killed were vacated for the Han people to live in and use. This allowed more Han people to be allocated their own houses. It was said that once the situation stabilized, the city gates could be opened to the outside world, and land would be distributed to everyone. This gave all the Han people hope. Since ancient times, land was the foundation of the people. As long as they had land, they could grow food, obtain a good harvest, and live on. It was precisely because Yang Chendong was considerate of them and gave them dignity that the Han people liked this young master. Even though many of them had already been allocated their own houses when it was time to eat, they would still rush to the square to eat and chat with the young master who brought them hope. Facing these people, Yang Chendong did not put on any airs. Instead, he squatted down and ate with everyone. After eating, he sat cross-legged on the ground and chatted with everyone. As for the content of the chat, there was a variety of topics. Since he did not put on any airs and was so amiable, it allowed him to quickly get closer to the people. Following that, when Yang Qindong talked about some matters and policies, he would receive a positive response from the people. After 2 days of interaction, the Han people also knew that this young master was the Duke of Loyalty and Courage of the great Ming dynasty. It seemed that he had a lot to say. After some of the bolder ones finished eating, they asked tentatively, "Duke, you guys have taken down Chu Yi. Presumably, that old fellow Li Li will not accept it. Will they take revenge here?" Just from the way they addressed him, it could be seen how much the Han people living in Jiaoji hated Li Li. Of course, this was also because they had their own dignity after interacting with Yang Qindong and the others for a few days. If it was in the past, they would definitely not dare to say such words. Yes. When this issue was raised, many people's faces changed. It was not easy to have their own dignity and hope for the future. They did not want everything to disappear so quickly. Seeing that everyone was so worried, Yang Qindong smiled. He knew that it was time to reassure everyone. "Didn't you all say that Li Li is an old man? Since he is already old, how can he be our opponent? Moreover, it's not like you haven't seen how powerful our army is. Other than the fact that we have fewer people now, our combat power is very strong. Don't worry. Unless the enemy doesn't come, no matter how many come, we will destroy them all. When the war starts, if you are interested, you can go up the city tower and see for yourself. Other people might be in danger guarding the city, but we don't have to." Chapter 481. When they heard that they could go up the city gate tower to watch the battle, some of them became excited. However, when they thought that war was not so fun, they wanted to retreat. However, when they saw Yang Qindong's confident look, they did not feel that afraid anymore. It seemed that they could go up the city gate tower to watch the battle. Looking at the hesitant expressions of these people, Yang Qindong sighed in his heart. The revolution had not succeeded yet. Comrades, you still have to work hard. These Han people had been oppressed for too long. If he wanted them to regain their confidence and become the master of Jiaoji, he would need a lot of time and many things to do. However, since he was here, he had to succeed. Otherwise, if he could not even handle a small Jiaoji, how could he talk about giving the Han people dignity and happiness? How could he talk about conquering the world? Another night passed. The Han people in Chu Yi City slept very well. They were slowly getting used to this feeling. It was also night time, but some people did not get any rest. They were the reinforcements from the north, Jishu, and Longbian cities. Since the king had given the order, they had to carry it out. In terms of execution, the Jiaoji army was better than the Ming army. Perhaps it was because the Ming army had been split into two. Seeing that it was going to be split into three, the generals had long changed their minds. They were no longer as happy to carry out the orders of their superiors. The speed of the Jiaoji army was not slow, especially in the middle. They had the most soldiers and the highest morale. Under the leadership of General Pan Wenfei, they wanted to achieve the greatest merit. They were the first to set off, and were now less than 10 li away from Chu Yi City. Seeing that the target was right in front of him, Pan Wenfei had a bold idea in his heart. Could he take advantage of the night to attack? If that was the case, he would be able to take down Chu Yi City before the other reinforcements arrived. That would be the greatest merit. Once this idea appeared in his mind, he could not get rid of it. Pan Wenfei, who was stimulated by the military merit, quickly made a decision. He then ordered the army to start resting. Everyone eat first and rest well. After 4 hours, we will begin the siege. At that time, all the credit will belong to us brothers. As Pan Wenfei rode his horse through the army, he explained his plan. The 2,000 Jiaoji soldiers were extremely excited. They didn't know how powerful Yang Xie's new army was. They had been staying in Beidai City for a long time, and they thought that they were the strongest soldiers in the world. Under such a mindset, one really dared to think of anything and do anything. However, one never considered whether one had such a big appetite and could do such an important thing. The scouts, who had been keeping an eye on the soldiers in the north, suddenly realized that they had stopped moving. They were still 10 li away from Chui City. Logically speaking, this shouldn't be the case. If it were them, they would at least stop at a distance of 5 miles from the city gate to rest and reorganize. This way, they would be able to achieve twice the result with half the effort when attacking the city tomorrow morning. Realizing that something was amiss, the scout squad leader sent a soldier back to the city to report. They couldn't tell what these people were up to, but the 6th young master should be able to tell. In their hearts, they had already deified the 6th young master and thought that he was a god sent down by the heavens. Otherwise, how could they explain the powerful firearms in their hands? They stopped 10 li away and haven't set up camp. In Chui City, Yang Qindong's expression revealed a look of understanding after hearing the scouts' report. After all, he had attended a military academy in the future and had studied countless battles since ancient times. He was already familiar with some of the tactics of his predecessors. Compared to the various three-dimensional battle tactics of the future, the battles of ancient times were sometimes like child's play. How could Pan Wenfei's little plan escape his eyes? Hee, they want to copy us and launch a night attack. Very good. Since that's the case, don't let them go back. A mature battle plan flashed through Yang Qindong's mind. Originally, Yang Qindong didn't have the idea of swallowing Pan Wenfei's troops, but he did have the intention of severely injuring them. Compared to other people who were afraid that their strength would be exposed in front of others, Yang Qindong did the opposite. He hoped that others would know how powerful he was so that when they fought, it would be twice the result with half the effort. Before they met the enemy, they would already have a 30% advantage in terms of momentum. With this thought, Yang Qindong needed someone to spread the news of the bravery of the Yang family army. Originally, this candidate was Pan Wenfei. It was very simple to achieve this goal. He only needed to severely injure the opponent who was scared out of his wits would surely spread the news for him. However, he didn't expect that Pan Wenfei would actually think of launching a night attack. This attitude of not putting the Yang family army in his eyes made Yang Qindong angry, but he also decided to take him down. Since he didn't even have the ability to see this, there was no need for such a general to continue living. As for the matter of spreading the news, it was very simple. Didn't Jishu and Longbian City have a total of 2,000 troops? He just needed to let them spread the news for him. Gather Commander Luo Pa and all the officers above battalion level in the city for an emergency meeting. Yang Qindong, who had a plan in mind, said to Tiger's Mane, who was standing at the side waiting for orders. Outside Chui City, after more than 4 hours of rest, the 2,000 soldiers from the north were in much better spirits. After eating and drinking to their heart's content, under the leadership of General Pan Wenfei, they groped their way towards Chui City, which was 10 miles away. Earlier, Pan Wenfei had already mobilized the troops before the battle. He made a promise to the 2 Kiliarchs and the 2 centurions under him. He said that once they were able to take down the city, money, women, and power would satisfy them to the greatest extent. With the general's promise, the morale of the troops was raised. Some of the young generals who were willing to think in the best possible way seemed to have already seen the scene of gold and silver placed in front of them. With such a vision and hope for a beautiful future, The 2,000 soldiers used a speed that was at least a quarter of their usual speed to arrive at a place 2 miles away from Chewy City. Looking up at the top of Chewy City from this position, they could already see the figures of soldiers moving around under the lit torches. Everything is normal. Seeing that there was nothing out of the ordinary, and even the number of guards on the top of the city tower was not many. Thinking about it, there must have been some lazy people who went to rest late at night. And this was the reason why Pan Wenfei wanted to launch a surprise attack in the middle of the night. As long as he grasped the right opportunity, he might be able to launch an attack. Listening to the scout leader beside him reporting the situation in Chewy City, Pan Wenfei, who was officially leading troops into battle for the first time, had a face full of excitement and agitation. Okay, if there are no problems, immediately arrange for the siege. The cities in Jiaoxi were not very tall. Perhaps it was because very few people came to invade, or perhaps it was because the resources were too scarce, there were not many things that could be used. In addition, there was not much historical evidence, so the city walls of their cities were more symbolic than defensive. For example, the city walls of Chewy City were only 2 zhang tall. It was more than 6 meters high, and it was possible to climb up with a rope. The siege that Pan Wenfei mentioned was the method of using ropes to forcefully climb the city walls. And as long as a large group of people and horses climbed up the city tower and opened the city gates from the inside, they could suddenly enter the city and deal a fatal blow to the enemy. The scales of victory would naturally tilt towards the Jiaoxi army. After the main general gave the order, a group of 100 people immediately moved forward under the cover of the night. These were the warriors that were carefully selected from the 2,000 people. They were more agile than ordinary soldiers. Once these people climbed up the city tower, it was basically a done deal for them to take down the city. After the elite group of 100 people set off, Pan Wenfei and the rest did not stay idle. The remaining 1,900 people quickly approached the bottom of Chewy City Tower. They were making their final preparations. Once the city gates opened from the inside, they would immediately kill their way into the city and display their bravery and grace. For a moment, Chewy City, which was originally shrouded in darkness, had black shadows moving continuously on top and bottom of the city walls. It was as though a large army was pressing down on the city. Creak! Just as the soldiers climbing the city tower and Beifeng's troops were moving towards their target, the originally tightly shut West City Gate suddenly opened from the inside. The sound of the heavy city gate opening was extremely shocking in the dark night. What's going on? The sudden change caused Beifeng's troops to stop in their tracks. The soldiers looked at the Dakarches looked at the Centaurians looked at the Kiliarchs, and the Kiliarch's gaze naturally landed on the dumbfounded General Pan Wenfei. At this moment, Pan Wenfei was also at a loss. He did not understand why the city tower opened on its own so quickly. Because of this, he said without any principles, is it because the enemy knows that we are here and knows that they can't defeat us, so they are opening the city gates and surrendering? Even the stupidest person would not believe this sentence. They did not know whether to laugh or cry at General Pan Wenfei's overly good self-suggestion. Charge! Just as the general and the soldiers' faces were sluggish, the sound of footsteps suddenly came from the originally pitch-black gate. After that, countless figures leaped out of the city gate like fish. 1, 2, there were countless of them. At this moment, there was no need for Pan Wenfei to say anything. Everyone understood what was going on. This was not because the enemy was afraid of them and had surrendered. They were already prepared and were about to charge out. Pan Wenfei, who was leading troops for the first time, was indeed shocked by the scene in front of him. In the past, when he was an armchair strategist, the things he did and his predictions were all wishful thinking. For example, in his imagination, when 2 armies were fighting, They would listen to him. Whoever he wanted to win would win. How could there be such an unexpected event like this happening before his eyes? Chapter 482. Things didn't develop as he expected, and Pan Wenfei lacked flexibility. His brain wasn't working properly, and he could only rely on a chilly arch beside him to remind him, "General, the enemy is prepared. Should we kill or retreat? Quickly make a decision." "We can't retreat." With this reminder, Pan Wenfei came back to his senses and said decisively, the morale that he had gathered with great difficulty would crumble in an instant if he retreated. Then, the army would be defeated like a landslide. Although he might be able to leave safely under heavy protection, this was not what he wanted to see. Since he was already here, Pan Wenfei naturally wanted to show off his achievements by showing up here in such an active manner. With the idea of the brave winning, when two armies met, Pan Wenfei, who was still a man, pulled out the saber at his waist and pointed it forward as he shouted the word, "Charge." Despite Pan Wenfei's bravery, his performance was still not enough in front of the mercenaries who were already prepared for this. When he shouted the word, "Charge," there were only a few torches on Chuyi's city gate tower, but suddenly there were many more torches. It was as if a fire dragon had suddenly appeared and lit up the entire city gate tower. The sudden appearance of the densely packed torches and an endless crowd of people was quite a shocking sight to behold. The appearance of the torches also shocked the elite warriors who were trying their best to climb up the city gate tower. Some of the weaker ones naturally fell from their waists. In fact, other than a row of Lung Feng, the rest of the people who appeared on the city gate tower were all ordinary citizens of Chui City. They were summoned by Yang Qindong to watch the battle in the middle of the night. Using the words of the sixth young master, if these people wanted to live here in the future, they must have confidence in the mercenaries. Watching the battle and witnessing the powerful military strength of the mercenaries was like a shot in the arm, allowing them to quickly change. However, under the darkness, how could the soldiers in the north know this? When they saw the black figures on the city gate tower, they instinctively thought that it was the enemy. When they saw that there were so many of them, they naturally became timid. It was also at this time that Lung Feng, the auxiliary soldiers, and the temporary auxiliary soldiers rushed out of the city gates and arrived. Under the unified and deafening roar of "Kill," the 95 style and 88 assault rifles fired in unison. In just a single exchange, many Beiju soldiers lost their lives. There were only 2,000 soldiers in the Northern Army, and before they could even meet the enemy, 1/7 of them had already died. This kind of fighting spirit could be imagined. Some of the Northern Army soldiers who were responding to General Pan Wenfei's order to charge could not help but stop moving forward. Then, cold sweat broke out on their foreheads, and their faces turned ashen. Temporary auxiliary soldiers, it's time for us to perform meritorious deeds. Charge! A few temporary auxiliary battalion commanders saw that the opportunity had arrived. Without any explanation, they shouted loudly and ran forward with their crossbows in hand. They were prepared to fire the moment they got close enough. The saying of an army pressing on the border described the current situation of the temporary auxiliary soldiers. They had already been caught off guard, and many of their soldiers had died before they even met the enemy. At this moment, the soldiers of the North were already terrified, coupled with the sudden attack of the temporary auxiliary soldiers. At this moment, their morale, commitment, and courage had all disappeared. The only thing they could do was to instinctively turn around and run. However, it would take time for the charging army to suddenly turn around and run. This was the hope of the temporary auxiliary soldiers. They only had crossbows in their hands and did not have the advantage of long-range combat like Lung Feng and the auxiliary soldiers. if they wanted to perform meritorious deeds. If they wanted to join the auxiliary soldiers, they needed to have enough military merits. How to perform meritorious deeds on the battlefield was undoubtedly the best shortcut to becoming a glorious auxiliary soldier. Without effort, there would be no reward. Seeing that the opportunity was right in front of them, a total of 14 battalions of auxiliary soldiers, a total of 5,000 people, ran forward with all their might. There were less than 2,000 enemies. If anyone was a step slower, they would not be able to perform any meritorious deeds. Under such pressure, who would not give their all? The temporary auxiliary soldiers charged forward. Once they got close, the crossbow bolts rained down like rain. Under such a powerful attack, not to mention 2,000 Northern Army soldiers, even 10,000 Jiaoji soldiers would not be able to do anything. Furthermore, they were already scared out of their wits. They definitely could not win the battle. It all depended on who was faster and who was lucky enough to escape. More than 1,000 Northland soldiers had charged forward, stopped, and turned around to flee. Their weapons and armor were scattered all over the ground as they ran. They hated the fact that they were carrying too much and too heavy. Anything that could lighten their load was thrown away. The soldiers turned around and ran. In the face of death, they unleashed their potential. The centurions, Kiliarchs, and even General Pan Wenfei, who were usually lax in training, were the unlucky ones. Without anyone to protect them, they became the last to run. They also became the first targets of the temporary auxiliary soldiers. The crossbow bolts did not have eyes. In order to perform meritorious deeds, the temporary auxiliary soldiers did not care if they were facing ordinary soldiers or high and mighty generals. They only knew one thing, and that was to kill. If they killed someone, they could take the head and claim the credit. With meritorious deeds, they would have the opportunity to become an auxiliary soldier. If they could even become a cold vanguard, that would be even better. The temporary auxiliary soldiers were eager to perform meritorious deeds. Arrows rained down like rain. Poor General Pan Wenfei, who couldn't run anymore, turned around and held his sword, ready to fight. But soon his pupils began to dilate, and he fell to the ground like a hedgehog. Until the moment he was shot to death, he still could not understand. He still could not face the moment before his eyes. After all, everything happened too quickly. It was so fast that it was easy to think that it was a dream. Pan Wenfei died, followed by the Kiliarchs and Centurions. Then, a large number of Northern Army soldiers were caught and shot to death. Only a few of them reacted quickly. They squatted on the ground and shouted to surrender. Only then did they avoid death. A total of 2,000 Northern Army soldiers. In less than 2 hours, the battle was completely over. After counting, not a single one of the 2,000 soldiers managed to escape. This showed how much the temporary auxiliary soldiers wanted to perform meritorious deeds. From the mouths of the captured soldiers, they found Pan Wenfei, whose body was full of crossbow bolts. When Hongjin saw this scene, he was so frightened that he sucked in a breath of cold air. After witnessing the power of the mercenaries once again, he finally understood why he lost so miserably. Compared to the powerful Jiaoji army in the eyes of others, the Jiaoji army was nothing but a man-eating wolf. In front of the mercenary tiger army, the Jiaoji army was nothing. Pan Wenfei was eager to perform meritorious deeds and had already revealed too many flaws. Even if the two armies were to fight head-on, there would be no chance of victory. In front of the mercenaries, who had strong morale, strong fighting spirit, advanced weapons, strict military discipline, and elite qualities, there was no army in the world that could be their opponent. There were probably very few who were qualified to be their opponent. Not only Hongjin, but the civilians on the city gate tower were also completely shocked when they saw this scene. Although most of them had not experienced war, This term was only what they imagined it to be. However, they had heard from the older generation that war was either a matter of life and death. As the saying went, a general's success was built on the bones of thousands. Victory had always been hard to come by. It required the blood and bones of countless people to accumulate. How could it be as simple as what they saw? One group of people kept charging, and the other group kept retreating. How could it be as simple as what they saw? One group of people kept charging, and the other group kept retreating. The Han civilians of Jiaoji witnessed the heroic performance of the mercenaries on the battlefield. While they were sighing at how easy it was to win, their hearts were filled with boundless admiration and respect for this army. None of the 2,000 enemies managed to escape. None of the auxiliary soldiers who charged out were killed. Only a few of them suffered from varying degrees of injuries. This kind of result that could be considered as a complete victory shocked the 2,000 Han civilians of Chui City. It filled them with confidence for their beautiful future. At the same time, some of the Jiaoji citizens who originally had other thoughts also began to give up at this moment, putting away all of their negative thoughts. Hurry up and clean up the battlefield. Set up the Jingguan. Seize the time to rest. There are still enemies coming at dawn. The shouts of the officers rang out continuously below the city gate. Then, groups of mercenaries shuttled back and forth busily. The Jingguan was an ancient burial mound used to flaunt one's martial arts and gather the corpses of the enemies. The reason why Yang Qindong wanted to set up the Jingguan was naturally because he wanted to create a better deterrent effect. If possible, he did not want to target the ordinary Jiaoji civilians and soldiers. What he wanted was the lives of the few people who held the highest positions. He wanted the lives of the foreign races who were hostile to the Han people. If he wanted to rule over this place, he would need the support of a large population. If he killed all of them, this place would become a piece of scorched earth. This was not the result he wanted to see. The night passed in such a bustling manner. The next morning, a Jingguan with close to 2,000 men was set up and placed 5 li away from the west gate of Chui City. The reinforcements from Jishu and Longbian arrived at this place after daybreak. This was what they saw. The tall Jingguan suddenly appeared in their field of vision, causing the 2,000 Jiaoji soldiers to stop in their tracks. When the scouts they sent out reported that the corpse of General Pan Wenfei was hanging on the city gate tower of Chui City, they finally knew the origin of this Jingguan. Chapter 483. Based on the information they received, Pan Wenfei's troops from the north had only arrived 10 hours earlier than them. How could they have been wiped out in such a short period of time? If that was the case, what kind of terrifying enemy were they facing? While the 2 reinforcements were analyzing the situation, the 6 auxiliary battalions left the city after a good night's sleep. After yesterday's victory, Yang Qindong intended to increase the combat strength of the auxiliary soldiers. This time, he did not send out the most elite Lung Feng. However, even with 3 auxiliary battalions in each direction, there were only a little more than 1,000 men. They were far from a match for the 2 Jiaoji reinforcements. When the 3 auxiliary battalions suddenly appeared in each direction, the 2,000 reinforcements sent by Jishu City and Longbian City resisted for a while. When they discovered that the advanced firearms in the auxiliary battalion's hands could cause a large area of long-range damage to them without waiting for them to engage the enemy, they finally understood the strength of their opponents when they saw the soldiers in the front line falling to the ground one by one with the sound of gunfire. With such powerful firearms that could take their lives from 300 to 400 meters away, such an opponent was truly terrifying. Run! Without any exciting close combat, the 2,000 Jiaoji reinforcements turned around and fled. Along the way, they left behind about 700 corpses. This was because they escaped quickly enough. If they really fought to the death, these 2,000 men would face the danger of being completely wiped out. The scale of the Jingguan became even larger. Although the Jingguan seemed extremely terrifying, the citizens of Chu-Yi City felt exceptionally peaceful. With the protection of such a powerful army, they could finally put aside their worries about the Jiaoji army's revenge. Although the 2 consecutive battles were not intense, the results were gratifying. After the 2 battles, Yang Qindong made the decision to go deeper into the inner region of Jiaoji. In order to protect the citizens of Chu-Yi City that had already been conquered and to better consolidate the hearts of the people, the political commissar of the auxiliary battalion, Songzhe, was left behind. The mission Yang Qindong gave him was to persuade the Han and Jiaoji citizens as quickly as possible. The day Jiaoji was conquered would be the day they would be put to use. At the same time, 2 auxiliary battalions and 2 temporary auxiliary battalions were left behind. With this military strength, it would be enough to defend the city even if the enemy was several times stronger. After arranging everything in the city, Yang Qindong brought the 3rd Battalion of the 2nd Regiment, the 6 battalions of the Auxiliary Army, and the 14 battalions of the Auxiliary Army, a total of over 7,000 people, and headed towards Beidai City in the direction that Pan Wenfei had come from. At this moment, Chu-Yi City, which was facing Chu-Yi City, had already changed hands. When Battalion Commander Chen Bo of the Cold Front brought the 2nd Battalion and 2 auxiliary battalions to Chu-Yi City, which was still open, the unguarded Chu-Yi City was swallowed up in an instant. Of the 40,000 citizens in the city, less than 2,000 managed to escape. The remaining 38,000 people, including the 3,000 Han, were all locked up in the city. Chen Bo's appearance was like a heavenly soldier descending from the heavens, causing the commoners in the city to close their doors. Everyone's expression changed. The originally bustling city instantly became much emptier, as if it was a dead city, cold and cheerless. Chen Bo did not choose to search every house like he did in Chu-Yi City. Instead, he first sent a battalion of auxiliary soldiers to occupy the city towers and a company of soldiers to guard every gate. Then, he sent men to seal the treasury of Chu-Yi City, obtaining large amounts of food and a small amount of gold and silver. With sufficient food, Chen Bo ordered the remaining battalion of auxiliary soldiers to patrol the streets, maintaining the security of the city. The remaining Cold Front battalion became a mobile force, preventing any large-scale mutiny from occurring in the city. This was something that could not be helped. He only had 12 companies of 1,200 men, and to maintain the security of a city of 40,000 people, coupled with the fact that he was a newcomer, he had to be wary of any enemies that might appear at any time. His military strength was truly lacking, if not for the fact that he knew that the 6th young master would be arriving soon. He would have already thought of leaving after robbing the treasury. The 2,000 citizens of Jiaoji who had escaped quickly spread the news of the fall of Chu-Yi City. 200 li behind them was the capital of Jiaoji, Haniai City. When the news reached there, it caused chaos in the city. If not for the protection of the 30,000 Jiaoji soldiers stationed here, no one knew what would have happened. Jiaoji Palace. King Lili also received the news. His face was filled with disbelief, but at the same time, he was confused. It wasn't just King Lili who couldn't figure it out. Even the officials who had been urgently summoned couldn't figure it out. How could Beidao City change hands without any warning? Why was there not even a basic warning or resistance? What was the defending general Pan Wenfei doing? Fortunately, Prime Minister Wan Chuncheng, who arrived at the end, gave an answer. He said that Pan Wenfei was eager to gain merit and took all the soldiers in Chu-Yi City to attack. At this time, the news of the Chu-Yi City being placed in the capital had not yet spread. Naturally, no one knew whether Pan Wenfei was dead or alive. However, losing Beidai City was a fact. Just based on this, King Li, who was sitting high above, vented his anger and said, Pan Wenfei is an idiot. He only knows how to attack and not defend. He is an idiot. Once the war is over, demote him to the rank of Chiliarch. Old Li, who was in his 60s, demoted Pan Wenfei before hearing the results of Chui City. If General Pan Wenfei knew about this, who knew how he would feel? However, since Chui City had changed hands, there was no point in punishing Pan Wenfei. What they needed to do now was to take back Chui City. Otherwise, it would become an existence that could threaten Hanoi City at any time. Who is willing to lead troops to solve the problem of Chui City? His gaze that was like that of a tiger king scanned the hall of the palace, especially the few generals. Li asked in a low voice, I am willing. Just as he finished speaking, a 7-foot-tall middle-aged man stood out. This person's gaze was like a pillar. Just standing there, he naturally gave off an intimidating aura. He was the famous general of Jiaoji, Fan Yuhai. Fan Yuhai was the 4th largest surname in Jiaoji and had a lot of influence in the country. The main reason why he could be called a famous general was because of the conflicts between Jiaoji and the Lan-Tsang kingdom, which was today's Laos. He played a big role in it. He led troops to fight against the Lan-Tsang army 3 times and won all 3 times. That was why he was called a famous general. Fan Yuhai, being able to take the initiative to stand up, made King Li very happy. However, he didn't agree to such a request. In his opinion, the enemy was unknown, and they didn't even know their numbers. The only thing they knew was that they were mercenaries. Under such circumstances, if they sent out a famous general and lost, the morale of the entire country's army would be greatly shaken. Not agreeing to Fan Yuhai's request, Li's gaze landed on another general called Huang Hua. In comparison, this person was shorter. However, he had led troops to fight against the Lan-Tsang army. Although he did not have any outstanding achievements, he had been on the battlefield and seen blood. General Huang Hua, this king orders you to lead 5,000 troops to Beidao City. Are you willing to accept the order? Although it was a question, anyone could tell that if Huang Hua dared to disagree, he would not have a good time. This subject is willing to accept the order. How could Huang Hua not see the king's intention? Although he himself was not willing to accept this task, since he was named, he already had no other choice. Very good. You can lead the troops with peace of mind. According to the reports, the number of mercenaries is less than 10,000. The Liangshan region should be their main force. You shouldn't have to face many enemies. Li comforted Huang Hua. After speaking, he looked at Prime Minister Wan Chunqing and said, Send someone to tell Qin Heijin and General Wan Gengwang to end the battle quickly and show the might of Jiaoji's army. This subject understands. Wan Chunqing bowed. He could tell that the king was unhappy. He decided to immediately send someone to find Wan Gengwang and tell him to perform well. Otherwise, the Wan family would not be able to get any benefits. In the vast and boundless Lang Mountain, the scene of a chaotic pursuit was playing out. Wan Gengwang led 30,000 troops, and Qin Heijin also led 30,000 troops. They were only facing Wu Sheng's Cold Front Battalion and 2 auxiliary battalions, totaling 1,200 people. 60,000 against 1,200, with a ratio of 50-1. The result seemed to be set in stone. However, the truth was the opposite. In the 10 days of pursuit, the Jiaoji army, which had the advantage in numbers, suffered heavy losses. The Cold Front Battalion had gone through special training in the rainforest. When they separated from Yang Qindong's main force, they had obtained a large amount of ammunition, especially the number of landmines. Each of them had 10 of them. In addition, Wu Sheng, as the leader, had given his subordinates the authority to attack in groups. Each group would be split into 2 groups. The squad leader and assistant squad leader would each lead a group. This meant that there were 240 units. Just think about it. In the process of pursuit, they had to face the attacks of 200 units at any time. No one would be able to stand it. It was just like in the rainforest. No one knew when there would be a loud explosion. Needless to say, this was caused by the Jiaoji soldiers behind them stepping on a landmine. If one could not understand the secret signal between the Cold Front Battalion, they would not know where the landmines were. In the rainforest, the terrain was steep and complicated. Everywhere could be a good place to set up a landmine. In addition, the scattered Cold Front Battalion would occasionally launch a sneak attack. It was easy to imagine the situation of the Jiaoji army. Chapter 484. In front of a low-lying ditch, there were 5 Lungfeng brothers lying in ambush around it. The trench was naturally formed. After years of being watered by the rain, soil erosion was severe, causing the water in the trench to be knee-deep. An invisible landmine was buried under the trench. The reason why the landmine was buried here was because the area was surrounded by large trees. In comparison, only this low-lying area was suitable for humans to walk through. During their training in the rainforest some time ago, Yang Qindong had mentioned that such a place was often the only way for humans to travel. The 5 Lungfeng brothers surrounded the trench. There was 1 person on each of the 2 large trees on the left and right. They looked down from above. Not only could they kill the enemy from above, they could also act as sentries. 2 Lungfeng warriors were also hiding in the bushes on the left and right of the trench. They were in charge of catching the fish that might have fallen into the net after passing through the trench. The last person was the leader, the squad leader of the 5. He was in charge of maneuvering. He was in charge of luring the enemy and retreating. Do not underestimate the task of luring the enemy. He could only lure a large number of enemies if he did it well. On the other hand, no matter how good the trap was, it would only be a beautiful decoration if no one fell for it. Squad leader. There are enemies 200 meters to the southeast. Squad leader Lungfeng, who was leaning against a large tree and chewing on a fresh leaf, heard his comrades shout. 15 minutes ago, this squad leader had lured a Jiaoji corporal out. In less than the time it took to drink a cup of tea, he killed all 5 enemies near the puddle. Then, he dragged the bodies of the dead enemies to the bushes to hide them. After doing all this, the squad leader wanted to rest and recover his strength, but he heard his comrades' warning. The enemy was an order. The squad leader, who was resting with his eyes closed, suddenly opened his eyes. Like a venomous snake that had spotted its prey, he arched his body and shot out. Naturally, the direction was southeast. He wanted to lure the enemy over and eliminate them without leaving a trace. With Lung Feng's spear skills, even in an open battle, the Jiaoji army would not be a match for him. However, in this dense forest, there were no logistical supplies. The ammunition that the soldiers brought with them was depleted. In order to complete the glorious mission that the 6th young master had entrusted to them, they needed to conserve their strength as much as possible. In that case, how to lure the enemy in front of them and hunt them down would become a test of their abilities. The squad leader shot out like a catapult. In just a few breaths, he appeared in the southeast direction. Since he had no intention of hiding himself, he was seen clearly by a squad leader of the Jiaoji army not far away. There's an enemy over there. Follow me, quick. He had been in the rainforest for a long time. From time to time, he could hear explosions and gunshots in the distance, but he had never seen an enemy. This inevitably made Shen Chong feel like he was dealing with ghosts. Now that he finally saw a living opponent, How could he let him go? After a loud shout, the 9 soldiers behind him followed him and chased in the direction where Lung Feng had disappeared. On top of the 2 giant trees, the 2 Lung Feng soldiers who had seen the movements of the Jiaoji army made a hand signal to their comrades below the trees. After informing them that there were 10 enemies, they raised their 95 style and stared at the 2 people in front and behind the enemy. It was impossible to keep an eye on 10 people with 2 guns. However, as long as they kept an eye on the head and the tail, the enemy would not be able to escape. This was common knowledge that they had to master during their training. Due to the appearance of Yang Qindong, the experience gained by countless predecessors in the future had become knowledge that was stored in the minds of the Lung Feng soldiers. The squad leader, who had no idea that he was being targeted, was so excited that he wanted to catch his opponent. He yelled as he led his 9 brothers to chase after squad leader Lung Feng. Under Lung Feng's intentional bait, the distance between the 2 parties was maintained within 50 meters. At such a distance, the enemy would not lose sight of them and would not be able to hurt them with arrows. One had to know that in this environment where there were tall trees and bushes everywhere, sometimes even a bullet would miss, let alone an ordinary bough. As expected, after shooting a few arrows consecutively without hitting the target, the squad leader decisively ordered the soldiers to stop shooting and focus on their legs. They had to speed up and catch up with the enemy, who appeared and disappeared like a ghost. As one of the black soldiers under General Chen Jinhe, the 10 of them were considered the cream of the crop in the Jiaoji army. Just like in the rainforest, they were able to run as fast as they could. It was not much different from running on the open ground. Elites naturally had the confidence of elites. It was because of this confidence that they did not give up on chasing after the enemy, even though they knew that something was wrong. This was how the truly powerful were. They were not afraid of any schemes and machinations with their valiant strength. The enemy's speed was very fast. Lung Feng, who was leading the way, had no choice but to use all his strength to leave them behind. When he arrived at the puddle, he jumped over the puddle and ran to the other side to hide. Just as Lung Feng's figure disappeared, the black soldiers caught up with him. The squad leader, who was running at the front, leaped into the air without hesitation when he saw the puddle in front of him. He followed squad leader Lung Feng's example and leaped over the puddle before continuing to run forward. After the 10-man squad leader leaped into the air, the other 2 black soldiers also leaped into the air and leaped over the 2.5-meter tall puddle. The cold blade warriors who were hiding on top of the tree saw all of this and could not help but feel a little anxious. If these black soldiers could really jump over the puddle, wouldn't it mean that the ambush in the puddle would be useless? Thinking of this, one of the cold vanguard soldiers lowered the muzzle of his gun. He was ready to fire, although the hit rate of this kind of high-speed enemy was a little low, and it was easy to expose his position. He couldn't care less at this time. Just as the Lung Feng soldiers were about to fire to see if they could hit the black soldiers and trigger the landmine in the puddle, another black soldier jumped up. However, perhaps because he had used up too much of his stamina, his leap was short and his left foot landed in the puddle. It was this unintentional carelessness that brought about a fatal result. A column of water suddenly rushed out from the puddle, followed by a deafening roar. The landmines in the puddles were triggered, and the powerful explosive force of the gunpowder directly sent the 4 black soldiers who were closest to the puddles flying. The powerful explosion caused the black soldiers to involuntarily pause. At this moment, 4 gunshots rang out. The 5 soldiers, including Captain Lung Feng, each fired a shot, and all of them hit their targets. 4 of them were killed in the explosion, and 5 were shot dead. In a short period of time, the squad leader was the only one left out of the 10 black soldiers. This squad leader was also impressive. He did not have the slightest intention of running away when he saw that all his brothers were dead. On the contrary, he noticed that the squad leader had exposed his identity by firing a shot. Then he pounced on him like a ferocious tiger. After killing a black soldier, the squad leader did not have time to turn his gun around when he sensed a black shadow approaching him quickly. Instinctively, the Lung Fong soldier rolled to the side. Thanks to this roll, the long saber that was descending from the sky missed its mark and left a deep saber mark on the ground. The squad leader quickly rolled away after missing his shot. He rushed toward the squad leader, Lung Fong, who was still standing up. The long saber in his hand was like a blender. It seemed like he wanted to perish together with the squad leader. The squad leader, Lung Fong, had just stood up from the ground. His body was unstable, and the muzzle of his gun was not fully adjusted. His instincts told him that he might not be able to hit the target if he fired the shot. He might even be injured by the opponent's long saber if he wasted time. Helplessly, he could only continue to lean back and roll backward. The squad leader's reaction was somewhat out of the squad leader's expectation. After knowing that his opponent was strong, he felt the existence of danger. Since his first and second shots did not hit the target, he wanted to find a place to hide. What happened just now told him that his opponent had reinforcements nearby, and he was fighting alone. The thought of hiding flashed across his mind. Just as the squad leader was about to dive into the bushes at the side, a gunshot was heard. The squad leader's body swayed a little before he fell to the ground with a plop. Some water droplets splashed when his body hit the ground. The shot was fired by a squad leader who was hiding in a giant tree. He felt that his opponent was trying to escape, so he fired without hesitation. He did not have much confidence at first, but now it seemed that he was lucky. After the gunshot, Lung Fong adjusted his posture and dashed over. The dagger in his hand flashed and plunged into the chest of the black squad leader, who had fallen to the ground. Finishing off the enemy was one of the compulsory courses for the squad leaders. When Yang Chendong was training for this course, he once said that they should never take any chances and should not be too confident in themselves. Since ancient times, countless talented people had died because they underestimated their opponents. Therefore, regardless of whether the opponent was really dead or not, they should give the finishing blow if they could. If they couldn't, they should give the finishing blow. They should never let the enemy go just because they wanted to save energy. Otherwise, it would be the greatest crime and irresponsibility to their comrades. Chapter 485. After the last stab, the black soldier's body trembled again. It was a normal reaction before death. After sensing that the target was dead, Lung Fong gave a thumbs up to the Lung Fong on the tree, praising the beauty and brilliance of the shot. Then he turned to the other 4 comrades and said, "Clean up the battlefield and prepare to retreat to the next ambush location. Also, leave a landmine under the enemy's corpse. Also, leave a mark to alert other comrades who might be passing by." Following Captain Lung Feng's words, except for one warrior on the tree who was responsible for keeping watch, the other 3 came to the ground and began to clean up. After 15 minutes, the battlefield was cleaned up and the landmines were planted. Then, the 5 of them left quietly to complete the next ambush mission. Scenes like this were happening all the time in the dense forests of Langsun. More than 200 small teams were constantly completing missions like this. And once they killed a group of enemies, it would be time for them to reap a harvest. For example, the rations that the enemy had on them would become their supplies. It was true that if there was no food or water, the enemy would give them to us, with more than 200 squads. Even if each squad only killed 10 people a day, the Jiaoji army would lose 2,000 men not to mention that some squads could kill 3 or even 4 squads a day. In just 5 days, the Jiaoji army had already lost more than 15,000 men. There would always be small groups that would mysteriously lose contact with them. When this news reached the ears of General Wang Gengwang and Chen Heijin, it made them very frustrated. Even worse, the king had given an order. He mentioned that Chu Yi City and Beidai City had both fallen. Based on the situation there, the king believed that there would not be many mercenaries in Langsun. He requested them to quickly end the battle here and return to Hanoi City to reinforce it. How can we possibly return to reinforce it? The tanned Chen Heijin slammed his palm on the wooden table in the temporary camp. His originally tanned face looked even scarier due to his anger. It was no wonder that Chen Heijin was so angry. Ever since he started leading the army, he had never fought a battle like this. They couldn't even see where the enemy was. At least 5,000 of their soldiers had died. This feeling of not being able to touch or hit the enemy was the most infuriating. Chen Heijin neither objected nor agreed with the king's order that there would not be too many enemies. However, he supported the idea of returning to Hanoi City to reinforce the city. As the saying goes, when an expert shows his hand, one will know whether or not he is an expert. Regardless of the number of enemies in the rainforest, at least their combat power was astonishing. From the start of the battle until now, his subordinates did not even bring back a single enemy's corpse. Just based on this, he did not dare to be the slightest bit careless. How could he dare to attack crazily, pass down the order, pull back the troops, and move towards Hanoi City? Chen Heijin said to his deputy with a serious face. "General, the king wants us to finish off our opponents quickly before returning to reinforce them." The deputy general beside him thought that he had misheard the military order and reminded him softly, "Of course this general knows. But in such an environment, how can we find our opponents and fight them? It's better to retreat immediately and find a spacious place. When that time comes, these people will have to come out." Chen Heijin looked forward with a deep gaze. He had always thought that his black soldiers were the kings of the rainforest. However, after encountering an opponent stronger than himself, he realized how useless it would be to continue fighting like this. Instead of being constantly weakened, it was better to withdraw from here and look for another opportunity. Oh, right, inform all the soldiers to not be too anxious when retreating. All the troops must be close to each other to prevent giving the enemy any chance to attack. Chen Heijin did not dare to underestimate the enemy in front of him. Even when retreating, he was still cautious. Unlike Chen Heijin, Wang Gengwang immediately made the decision to withdraw from the rainforest and go to Hanoi City for the sake of his family's development after receiving the secret order from the Prime Minister. In order to achieve this goal in a shorter period of time, he made the decision to allow each army to retreat on their own. From his point of view, since he had already decided not to fight, the mercenaries would not be so stubborn as to not let him go. Because Wang Gengwang's order to retreat was very urgent, many of the troops scattered outside did not have time to retreat. However, he did not consider this. According to the Prime Minister's secret letter, returning to Hanoi as soon as possible was the most important thing. Everything else could be put aside for now. Leading the 10,000 Jiaoji soldiers, they quickly advanced through the rainforest of Mount Liang. This kind of military operation caught the Cold Vanguard Army off guard. When Battalion Commander Wu Sheng, who was leading the team, heard the news from the scout, he was still in a daze. Battalion Commander, it must be because the 6th young Master Sun Bian gave them too much pressure. These people can't take care of us. Yes, Battalion Commander, this is a great opportunity for us. We can use this opportunity to gather our troops and launch a counterattack. The two company commanders of the Cold Vanguard Army expressed their thoughts. Wu Sheng's eyes lit up when he heard these words. That's right. Such a desperate retreat will definitely leave behind many openings. Even though the Cold Vanguard Army had been wearing down the Jiaoji Army's forces, they had been searching for opportunities while defending or fleeing. They wanted to launch a frontal attack, but the difference in numbers was too great. Based on Yang Qindong's idea of paying the greatest price with the smallest price, Wu Sheng had never made up his mind to launch a large-scale counterattack. However, things were different now. Wang Gengwang's sudden retreat must not only have caught them off guard, but also the Jiaoji army that he led. The various armies did not retreat at the same time. This caused some of the Jiaoji soldiers to stand out from the rest. How many troops can we immediately contact? Wu Sheng immediately made up his mind and began to prepare for the attack. Hearing Wu Sheng ask such a question, the two company commanders beside him shuddered and said excitedly, "Battalion commander, we have a total of 1 battalion and 2 companies, a total of 600 people. If we launch an attack in an emergency, we can gather 500 men." 500 men? In the end, it's still too little, Wu Sheng said with a sigh. This time, Yang Qindong had only given him 3 battalions to lure the enemy. Only one of them was the Cold Vanguard Battalion, while the other 2 were auxiliary battalions. In order to complete the mission better, he had split the 3 battalions into 2 groups, harassing Wang Gengwang's and Chen Heijin's forces. If not for the limited number of soldiers, he would have launched a large-scale counterattack long ago. Even though they were at a disadvantage in terms of military strength, they were well-equipped, well-trained, and well-coordinated. In the end, they managed to eliminate nearly 15,000 enemies in just over 10 days. Dividing up the losses, each soldier managed to kill at least 10 enemies. This was already a very impressive achievement. Yang Qindong's thoughts shifted from the question of the number of troops. When he looked at the 2 company commanders again, his expression was already very firm. All right, then inform all the soldiers we can contact to start the counterattack. But at the very least, we have to use platoons as a unit. If the number of soldiers is lower than this unit, we can only engage in guerrilla warfare and cannot initiate an attack. A platoon has at least 30 men. With 30 men as a unit, this number is already very low. If the number of soldiers is lower than this number, then it is no longer an attack, but a suicide mission. After all, if the number of soldiers is too small, there is no way to coordinate. Even if they have advanced firearms, if the enemy numbers are too high, they may not even have time to reload. If the battle really escalates to close quarters, then the losses of the Cold Vanguard Battalion would be unavoidable. This would make Wu Sheng have no choice but to answer to Yang Qindong. The orders from the battalion headquarters were quickly relayed through the Cold Vanguard Battalion's unique method of communication. Following that, the Cold Vanguard Battalion soldiers, who were originally hidden in various places, started to gather. They formed platoons and began their counterattack. With the Cold Vanguard Battalion's actions, the sound of gunfire in the rainforest became more intense. Once they formed a platoon, they would appear in the open in front of the Jiaoji soldiers who were still searching for them and wipe them out. Under the long-range attacks of the Type 95 and Type 81 rifles, the Jiaoji Centurions and Kiliarchs who thought they had finally found their targets and were able to contribute greatly to the battle began to flee in all directions. An unorganized army was just a bunch of stragglers who couldn't withstand a single blow. Even though the Cold Vanguard Battalion didn't have many soldiers, they were all elites. Every time they fired a clip of bullets, a few Jiaoji soldiers would be killed. A platoon of Cold Vanguard Battalion soldiers could charge up to 300 to 400 people at a time. The Jiaoji soldiers who were lucky enough to survive were also terrified. They no longer had any intention of exterminating the mercenaries. Once they had the chance, they would flee in all directions. They couldn't form any effective resistance. Wan Gungwang, who was retreating back to Hanoi City, originally planned to gather his troops as he retreated. However, along the way, he only managed to gather less than 5,000 men. When he heard that at least 5,000 soldiers were killed by the mercenaries or escaped to God knows where, he clenched his teeth in anger. "General, should we go back now and fight the mercenaries until both sides suffer, or should we continue to retreat?" Seeing that the death toll was increasing, the Kiliarchs didn't dare to make a decision on their own. They could only pass the problem to Wan Gungwang. Chapter 486. Wan Gungwang's heart was filled with hatred. His face was so dark that it was almost dripping water. However, after a moment of hesitation, he gritted his teeth and said, "Retreat. Don't bother about the others. The safety of the king comes first." Yes, retreat. Hearing Wan Gungwang's final decision, the other Kiliarchs couldn't help but heave a sigh of relief. An entire army of 30,000 had entered the Langsun region. Not only did they not encounter the enemy, but they had also lost half of their forces. They didn't want to face such an opponent at all. Now that there was a clear order, who would dare to raise any objections? Wan Gungwang retreated. He threw everything he could in the rainforest of the capital city just so that he could leave faster. After Wu Sheng's troops killed a few Jiaoji scattered soldiers who had left the main group, they saw military supplies strewn all over the mountains and plains. There were also some iron weapons that they had snatched from the Han people after entering Yunnan. Now, in order to save their lives, these heavy ironware were abandoned. Yes, Jiaoji was that poor. They didn't have many resources. Even the ironware from the Han people's homes was considered good stuff in the eyes of the Jiaoji soldiers. "Battalion commander, what should we do? Are we still chasing after them?" the subordinate officer asked with a tired look on his face. Wu Sheng really wanted to continue chasing. This way, he believed that he would be able to reap some benefits when facing an army without any morale. However, he knew that the soldiers of the Cold Vanguard had been fighting continuously for more than 36 hours. They were really too tired. If they continued chasing, there would definitely be soldiers who would leave the army due to exhaustion. Since he had brought these people out, he would naturally try his best to bring them back. Tell the soldiers to find a place to bury these ironware and mark it. Then, find a safe place to rest. Yes, the officers below couldn't help but heave a sigh of relief when they heard that they could finally rest. They were really worried that the battalion commander would be so eager to gain merit that he would disregard everything and continue to kill the enemy. In that case, they would definitely carry out the orders. However, there would be casualties due to non-combat situations. That would definitely hurt their own foundation. After this battle in the rainforest, the combat power of all the soldiers who participated in the battle had increased by more than one level. Such elites would naturally become the backbone of Cold Vanguard in the future. Losing even one of them would be a heart-wrenching matter. When the mercenaries stopped chasing, Wan Gungwang could finally breathe a sigh of relief. However, the speed of his army did not slow down. On the contrary, they sped up. They were really afraid. They were afraid that if they relaxed, the mercenaries would chase after them, and their losses would be even greater. Wan Gungwang's fleeing speed was extremely fast, which naturally gave way to Chun Heijin's troops. Originally, they only had to face 1.5 battalions of mercenaries, but after Wu Sheng and the rest of the Cold Vanguard troops had a good night's rest, the 3 battalions of mercenaries gathered together the next day. With their increased strength, they put more pressure on the black soldiers and suffered greater losses. Putting aside the fact that the Jiaoji army in the Langsun region was constantly fighting and retreating, they had to pay a heavy price every day. In front of Beidai City, General Huang Hua, who was ordered by King Li to bring 5,000 soldiers, had also arrived. The moment they arrived at Beidai City, Huang Hua ordered the army to get into formation, following which the siege began. The moment Huang Hua's army arrived at the city, the originally quiet Beidai City became restless. Some of the Jiaoji tycoons who had been hiding in their homes took the opportunity to cause trouble, intending to work together to retake Beidai City. The reason why these tycoons dared to make a move was because they had already seen that there were not many enemies, only about 1,000 of them. This was the reason why they dared to make such a huge bet. 2nd Battalion Commander Chen Bo, who had long guessed that such a situation would occur, first withdrew his army, then arranged for 2 companies of auxiliary soldiers to be stationed at the West Gate. They were only waiting for the guards organized by the rich and powerful in the city to rush over, and then a burst of continuous fire. After a series of concentrated gunshots, nearly 100 corpses were left behind in front of the Western Gate. Only then did the rich people feel fear. Feeling fear, they retreated to their own courtyards and placed all their hopes on the Jiaoji army outside the city. After dealing with the internal threat, Chen Bo focused his attention on the Jiaoji army's siege. From afar, there were countless Jiaoji soldiers standing at the west gate of Beidai City. In comparison, there were only 3 battalions of young family soldiers guarding the city. However, this disadvantage in numbers didn't make Chen Bo and his soldiers show any signs of fear or worry. They were relying on the firearms in their hands. Brothers, don't panic. Let the enemies come first. When they are 100 meters away, the auxiliary soldiers will open fire and give them a head-on blow. Once they are about to retreat, the cold vanguard warriors will use 600 meters as a boundary to reap the lives of the enemies. In short, since the enemies are here, we cannot let them retreat too easily. Everyone, remember? Standing on top of the city gate tower, Chen Bo used his nightmare mirror to observe every move of the Jiaoji army. He calmly gave out orders. This wasn't the first time Chen Bo led an army alone. However, in the past, he only fought on a small scale within the Ming dynasty. When he fought against the Huang bandits, he was accompanied by other Ming soldiers and couldn't unleash his full potential. This time, however, there were no restraints, and he could fight as he pleased. With Chen Bo's calm command, the cold vanguard warriors, who were already elites, were fearless. Even when facing an enemy 4 times their number, they didn't show any signs of fear. On the contrary, each of them hoped that the enemy would come quickly and not be scared away. They didn't want the credit to fly away from them. The soldiers were of one mind. Chen Bo, who had finished his preparations, led the 3 battalions of soldiers to look ahead with bright eyes. Some of the company commanders and platoon commanders were still mumbling to themselves. "Come on, don't worry, we won't attack you first. We'll come as soon as possible." It seemed like their prayers were effective. The Jiaoji army, who had already set up a formation outside Beidai City, finally moved. A total of 3,000 men, more than half of the army, began to move towards the West Gate. There were only 5,000 men. Arranging 3,000 men for a charge was also the idea of the commander, Huang Hua. The intelligence report stated that the entire mercenary army only had about 10,000 men. There must be a portion of them in the Lang Sun region. The conquered Chu-Yi city also needed to be defended. Therefore, there shouldn't be too many enemies in Beidai City. At the very least, there shouldn't be much more than the soldiers under his command. Since there weren't many enemies, Huang Hua decided to send 3,000 men for a charge. He wanted to use the advantage of numbers to suppress the enemy. Perhaps this would be a good start. As for the remaining 2,000 men, there was a reason for that. Once the 3,000 vanguards were successful, the 2,000 at the back would have to join in and achieve victory in one go. However, if the situation wasn't good, The 2,000 men under his command would be able to hold their ground. At the very least, they would have the ability to defend. With this thought in mind, the 3,000 soldiers that Huang Huaxian had sent out began to move. Of the 3,000 men, 500 shield-bearers walked at the front. They were there to defend against the enemy's arrows. Behind him were 1,000 archers who were there to assist in the attack. Then there were 500 ladders. They were in groups of 5, and they were holding a total of 100 wooden ladders. This was to ensure that once the siege began, they could use the ladders to rush to the west gate of Beidai City. Finally, there were 1,000 siege soldiers. They held swords, spears, axes, and halberds in their hands. Their weapons were different, but once they reached the top of the tower, it was time for them to display their strength. With the combination of long and short weapons, their attack power was not low. The 3,000 soldiers of the Jiaoji army marched forward in an orderly fashion. From afar, they looked like a black mass. As they approached, it felt like dark clouds were pressing down on one's head. When they were still far away, the Jiaoji army moved very quickly. At least, that was the case when they were 400 meters away. They probably knew that within this distance, no one could threaten their safety. However, as soon as they entered the 400-meter boundary, their footsteps began to slow down. The shield-bearers were ready to raise their shields at any time. The archers were ready to shoot their arrows when they were within 100 meters. The ladder-bearers were ready to charge recklessly and set up scaling ladders to besiege the city. As they continued to move forward, when they were 300 meters away, their preparations became more complete. Just like the ladders were originally carried. Now, they were lifted and placed at their waists. When the time was right, they could raise them above their heads and charge forward. At a distance of 300 meters, the cold vanguard soldiers could already fire and achieve their goal of killing the enemy. However, Battalion Commander Chen Bo had already given the order to shoot only when the enemy was close enough. As a result, not only did no one open fire, they didn't even turn off the safety on their guns. This was also to prevent someone from getting too excited and accidentally firing, scaring away the fat meat in their hands. If that happened, they wouldn't even be able to find a place to cry. Under the gaze of the 3 battalions of the Yangxie army, the 3,000 Jiaoji army approached 200 meters, 150 meters, 120 meters. Everyone get ready. Release the safety. When they were 120 meters away, Chen Bo's calm voice rang out. Originally, he could have waited a little longer. However, he didn't want to wait until they were 100 meters away. He didn't want to wait for the enemy's archers to be able to fire before returning fire. If that happened, who knew if any of the arrows would hit the city walls and injure his soldiers? The losses would outweigh the gains. Chapter 487. Once the order was given, the sound of the guns being released could be heard. Then, the soldiers who were watching on the sidelines began to aim according to the 3 points in a straight line, each looking for their own target. After all this was done, the Jiaoji army had only moved 10 meters. However, within this 10-meter distance, one could clearly see that their footsteps had begun to increase. Clearly, they were worried that the mercenaries on the city wall would suddenly fire arrows. If their charging speed was fast enough, even though they might not be able to dodge the arrows, at least they would have a higher chance of success. The enemy changed from a slow pace to a fast pace, and then they began to jog. This was clearly a sign that they were about to increase their speed. The eyes of Battalion Commander Chen Bo, who was leading the team, narrowed. He held the Type 95 in his hand and pressed the butt of the gun against his shoulder. Using this as a support, he assumed a very standard and beautiful standing posture while firing the gun. Not only Chen Bo, but all the gunmen were ready to shoot. Now, they only needed to wait for the order to shoot the enemy and make a contribution. Finally, while jogging, the 3,000 Jiaoji soldiers at the front, who were the shield soldiers, had reached the 100-meter mark. The archers behind them also took out their feathered bows and arrows from the quivers on their waists, ready to draw their bows and shoot. Fire! Chun Bo's voice suddenly rang out. Following this voice, the Type 95 in his hand fired the first shot. The target was a person who looked like a small general in the Jiaoji army. Bang! Bang, 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 bang. After the sound of a gunshot, what followed was the scene of thousands of guns being fired. Bursts of popping sounds rang out, and the Jiaoji soldiers fell to the ground one after another. There was no sound of arrows piercing through the air, nor was there a dense cloud of arrows covering the sky. There was only the sound of gunshots and the appearance of the bullets shooting out in a straight line. This was completely different from normal warfare, and instantly caught the Jiaoji soldiers off guard. The first unlucky ones to be chosen as targets were naturally the 1,000 archers. They were the only ones who could pose a threat to the Lung Feng soldiers on the city gate tower. Naturally, they were the ones who suffered the most. Many archers didn't even have time to hold the arrows in their hands before they fell to the ground. Horrifying bloody holes could be seen in their heads. There were also some archers who had just grabbed their arrows and fell to the ground. Even when they died, their faces were filled with unwillingness. Clearly, they couldn't understand why they had died before they could even release their arrows or see the enemy's arrows flying towards them. 1,000 archers were the first to meet with misfortune. Most of them died before they could even set out. Less than 100 of them released their arrows anxiously. However, due to panic or their limited strength, they did not manage to hit the city gate tower. Or perhaps they had already lost their aim. Even if they managed to hit the city gate tower, they did not manage to hit the designated spot. Cold Blade, fire! They had already begun to attack. Just now, the 600 auxiliary soldiers had fired first, causing many enemy casualties and throwing the enemy camp into chaos. Seizing the opportunity, Chun Bo gave another shout, and the 400 soldiers of the Cold Vanguard began to attack from the furthest distance. 600 to 700 meters away, the square formation of the Jiaoji soldiers wielding sabers, spears, swords, and halberds also became the first target. The pitiful Jiaoji soldiers were still too far away and were completely unprepared. Suddenly, another wave of concentrated gunshots rang out. Many soldiers fell to the ground with a look of disbelief. This scene gave everyone a huge fright. The final range of an arrow wasn't 150 meters. At such a distance, only those with extremely strong arms could do it. Archers like this were 1 in 1,000. Most of the time, being able to shoot a distance of 100 meters and hit the target with the bow was already very difficult. In reality, the true killing range of an archer was around 60 meters. At such a distance, as long as one had undergone strict training and possessed a certain level of strength, one would be able to kill the enemy. In other words, the actual killing range of an arrow was only around 60 to 70 meters. However, a new weapon that could kill people from 600 meters away had suddenly appeared. That was equivalent to 10 times their attacking range. It was no wonder that the Jiaoji soldiers were afraid, flustered, and terrified. This type of sudden attack also caused the minds of the Jiaoji soldiers 600 to 700 meters away to become chaotic. Even though they saw their comrades die miserably beside them, there were still very few people who made the preparations to flee. At this moment, they were truly beaten silly. Taking advantage of the moment when the enemy was stunned, the Lung Feng soldiers and auxiliary soldiers on the western wall of Beidai City rained down bullets as though they were free. One after another, the Jiaoji soldiers who were targeted were hit by bullets and fell to the ground. There were too many enemies, too many targets, and too many choices. As a result, many of the soldiers switched from single shots to consecutive shots. The gunshots became even more intense. In just a few breaths, too many corpses had fallen below the city wall. The Jiaoji soldiers, who were lucky enough to survive, finally regained their senses and started to retreat frantically. However, no matter how fast they ran within a distance of 600 meters, they would still become living targets. Of the more than 1,000 people who ran back, less than 1/10 of them were lucky enough to survive. After witnessing the power of these advanced firearms, the Jiaoji soldiers had long given up on the idea of attacking the city. They ran as fast as they could. Many of them even threw away their weapons and other unnecessary items on the ground, hoping to move forward with light equipment so that they could run faster. As a result, the 500 shield bearers who were walking at the front were in a difficult position. They were originally charging at the front. With the shields in their hands, normal arrows would not be able to harm them. However, even though the shield seemed to be made of iron, its defensive power was greatly reduced in the face of advanced firearms. There were even situations where the shields were penetrated by bullets. Compared to the penetrative power of the bullets, these Jiaoji shield bearers who were holding wooden shields could not put up any effective resistance. That's right, they were holding wooden shields. As a Jiaoji that lacked metal and all sorts of resources, the number of soldiers who possessed metal shields was extremely small. Only the elites of the elites could possess such shields. Usually, the shields used in the army were only made of wood. It was sufficient to defend against long-range arrows. However, when faced with the sudden attack of bullets, it was naturally inferior. Wooden shields could not block bullets, and they were charging too close to the front. As a result, the 500 shield bearers were in an awkward position. Should they run? If they charged too close to the front, they would definitely not be able to escape. Should they charge with a wooden shield in their left hand and a dagger in their right hand? They were still fine in close combat. However, when faced with a 10-meter tall city wall, they were powerless. They could neither fight nor flee, especially when some of the 500 shield bearers wanted to retreat, but were killed. On the contrary, none of the 450 shield bearers who stood still and did not dare to move were hurt. Instead, they chose to stay where they were. If they stayed where they were, they would most likely become captives and lose their freedom. However, compared to retreating and dying, it was still much better. As a result, a somewhat dramatic scene appeared on the battlefield. The 400 shield bearers seemed to be wandering outside the battlefield. They stood there in an orderly manner, waiting for the judgment of the god of fate. Naturally, Uncle Chen also saw the 500 shield bearers. However, when he saw that they did not act rashly and instead stood there obediently, he stopped thinking of killing them. Bullets cost money, and the materials required were not cheap. If he could save a bullet, it was better to save a bullet. Moreover, the 500 shield bearers were all able-bodied men. For the sixth young master, who placed great emphasis on manpower, this was a considerable gain. Therefore, only a company of auxiliary soldiers were keeping an eye on the shield bearers. The rest of the soldiers continued to do what they were supposed to do. They continued to fire continuously. However, because the enemies who could escape had already run far away, they had already switched from continuous fire to burst fire. A total of 3,000 people charged forward, but in the end, less than 200 managed to escape. Other than the 400 shield bearers, the Jiaoji army suffered a tragic loss of 2,000 people in just a short period of time. This result completely frightened the Jiaoji army's general Huang Hua. After this battle, he finally understood why Chuyi City and Beidai City fell so quickly. Faced with such advanced firearms, he was afraid that no one would be able to stop them. "General, what do we do?" Seeing that the soldiers who charged out were retreating at an even faster speed, and less than 1/10 of them survived, a Chiliarch could not help but look at Huang Hua with a bitter expression. Frowning deeply, Huang Hua muttered to himself for a moment before making the decision to retreat. They had already lost more than half of their forces, and their morale was so unstable. If they continued to charge forward, they would not be able to return. Even if the king wanted to punish them, they could only choose to retreat. The general's decision to retreat made the Chiliarch beside him heave a sigh of relief. Following the order, the 2,000 Jiaoji soldiers who were already afraid of being beaten up frantically retreated at a speed that was more than 2 times faster than when they came. From the looks of it, humans truly cherished their lives. The Jiaoji army retreated. On the city walls, not a single soldier cheered loudly. Perhaps to them, this was something that could not be any more normal. Since that was the case, what was there to be happy about? On the contrary, there were 200 people who were displeased. They were the auxiliary soldiers who were arranged to guard Beidai City. Because of the previous incident where the Jiaoji citizens charged into the city, Chunbo was worried that there would be a fire behind him. Thus, he arranged for these 200 people to guard the rear. This also meant that they did not have any chance to participate in the battle. It was inevitable that they would feel resentful. Chapter 488. In order to ensure fairness, the 450 Jiaoji shield bearers who didn't dare to move were handed over to the 200 auxiliary soldiers. No matter what, it could be said that others ate the meat while they ate the soup. Thus, the 200 auxiliary soldiers opened the city gates under the lead of the 2 company commanders and walked out while glaring fiercely. In order to survive, the shield bearers had thrown all their weapons to the ground. Finally, they saw the mercenaries in green walk out. For some reason, they were not afraid at all. Instead, they felt as if a heavy burden had been lifted off their shoulders. If no one came out to receive them, it would be a dead end. Beidai City's defense was a great victory. More than 2,300 enemies were killed, nearly 500 were captured, and countless military supplies were obtained. When Yang Qindong rushed to Beidai City with the main force of more than 7,000 people, he heard such a report. On the other hand, in Hanoi, the capital of Jiaoji, bad news came one after another. As the king, Lu Li seemed to have aged a lot in an instant. There were even some voices questioning him, saying that he was going to let the young crown prince take over the throne in advance. When King Li heard these discussions, he only replied that he understood in a daze. Then he turned around and entered the royal palace, not seeing anyone else. The king didn't want to see anyone. This caused the officials to panic. Many of them went to Prime Minister Yuan Chunqing to ask for advice. Compared to the other officials who were panicking, Prime Minister Yuan Chunqing was much calmer. Everyone, don't worry. The crown prince is about to enter the city. Let's go welcome him together. Although Li had many concubines, he only had 2 sons. One was his eldest son, Li Siki, but he died early. The other was the crown prince's second son, Li Yuanlong. All this time, in order to not have any conflicts with the royal family, Li Yuanlong chose to go to Jiuzhen Prefecture in the south of Jiaoji. Since he was his father's only son, he wouldn't pass the throne to anyone else. Thus, the crown prince left the capital. Needless to say, this Li Yuanlong was quite capable. According to history, he had indeed inherited Li's legacy. During his reign as the king, the strength of Jiaoji had risen significantly. Geniuses would always show themselves wherever they went. For example, in Jiuzhen County, he relied on the geographical environment near the sea to make Jiuzhen County very prosperous. Of course, it was also because it was close to the sea that he had heard about mercenaries. Occasionally, when he sent out ships to trade with other countries, he would see mercenary warships with 5-starred red flags hanging high above. Compared to the ships of other small countries, the warships of the mercenaries were very domineering in terms of size, water consumption, and attack power. Rumor had it that their ships were equipped with heavy cannons that could sink any hostile ships from a long distance away. Slowly, the ships of the mercenaries became the masters of this area. If other ships wanted to pass through here, they had to pay a heavy tax. Li Yuanlong still remembered the first time he saw a mercenary warship with a red flag hanging high above the sea. Naturally, he was filled with envy when he saw the huge ship sailing past. Since then, Li Yuanlong had given strict orders to his subordinates to not make enemies with the mercenaries. On the contrary, they were to pay taxes on time and not play any tricks. It was because of this extremely correct decision that the ships of Jiaoji had been very safe. Because of this, they had made many maritime transactions with other countries and earned a lot of money. It was a pity that maritime transactions prohibited the use of ironware. Otherwise, Jiaoji would have been able to obtain even more ironware and increase the strength of its army. However, he never expected that his father and his country would make enemies with the mercenaries and even lead them to kill their way into the country. When he heard the news, Li Yuanlong rushed over with the 30,000 men of the Crown Prince's personal guards. On the way, he heard the news of the defeat of the army outside Beidu City. Outside the east gate of Hanoi City, Prime Minister Ruan Chuncheng led a group of civil and military officials to welcome the Crown Prince, Li Yuanlong. The officials warmly greeted the Crown Prince, the future king. For the sake of their future, it seemed like everyone wanted to curry favor with him. On the surface, Li Yuanlong was chatting and laughing with the officials. However, he quickly called Prime Minister Ruan Chuncheng to the side. Prime Minister Ruan, what is going on? Are the mercenaries really that strong on land? Sigh. At the mention of this question, the wise Ruan Chuncheng immediately shook his head in pain. Yes, Your Highness. General Huang Hua came back and said that the enemy had a type of gun that could shoot a few hundred feet away. It could take a person's life on the spot. A gun that could shoot a few hundred feet away. Even though Li Yuanlong was somewhat prepared when he heard this answer, he was still shocked and sighed. Because of Li Yuanlong's strategy, he had always thought that the Jiaoji ships and the mercenary ships on the sea were peaceful. This made him think that the enemy's cannons were limited in power. Therefore, they did not make enemies everywhere and became the true overlord of the sea. However, when he heard that they had such a powerful gun, he understood that it was not that they did not have the power to dominate, but that they were not willing to do so. As for the reason, others might not know, but Yang Chendong understood it best. It was that they did not have enough people and manpower. It was because they did not have enough people. Even if they occupied some places now, they would not be able to control them. Facing the enemy's armed forces, he could lead his army to wipe them out, but he couldn't just kill the foreign civilians. If he wanted to rule the world, killing them wouldn't solve the problem. He needed more Han people. Some glory wasn't just for him to enjoy. He needed more Han people to enjoy it together with him. Li Yuanlong was not Yang Chendong. Of course, he did not understand what the other party was thinking. When he heard that the mercenaries had attacked the country, he thought that his father had done something to offend them. Right, Prime Minister Wan, where's my father? After getting a rough understanding of the situation, Li Yuanlong asked with concern as he walked towards the palace in the city with the other officials. Prime Minister Ruan Chuncheng said with an ugly expression, His Majesty, the king entered the harem alone. He did not allow anyone to disturb him. Anyone? Does that also include this prince? When Li Yuanlong heard this answer, he was first stunned. Then he thought of something and revealed a look of joy. Yes, the king specifically said that he would not see the crown prince. Yuan Chunqing was much more straightforward when he replied. Since there were some things that could not be avoided, then there was no need to avoid it. Although it was a little bullying, he was the king after all. Furthermore, there was no need to bully a father and son. When he heard this affirmative answer, Li Yuanlong's expression slowly returned to normal. He finally understood that his father had left the mess for him to deal with. If there was a mistake, then it would be his fault. Not only would his father not support him, but he would also criticize him and even take back his authority. On the other hand, if he did it well, then his father would have to abdicate. Li Yuanlong was indeed someone who had been the crown prince for many years. He was able to understand the situation so quickly. This was also why Prime Minister Yuan Chunqing had an ugly expression when he answered this question. However, there was nothing he could do. After all, Li Yuanlong was the king, and he was only the king's son. The so-called kinship. I almost forgot. In the face of huge benefits and reputation, there was no kinship in the royal family. After knowing his father's plan, Li Yuanlong did not have any intention of avoiding it. The fact that he had rushed over from Jiuzhen County after receiving the imperial edict was enough to explain everything. If he really wanted to avoid it, he could have just said that he was not feeling well and did not appear. Furthermore, as the crown prince and the future king, Li Yuanlong did not want to see anything happen to Jiaoji. However, since there was a problem, it had to be solved. The heavy responsibility of solving this problem fell on his shoulders. This was his responsibility. Since that is the case, I will have to trouble Prime Minister Yuan to gather all the officials. This crown prince would like to hear their opinions. Since the problem was to be solved, it was naturally Han Xian who gathered the soldiers. The more the better. If he listened to their opinions, he might be able to find a way to solve the problem. Although Li Yuanlong already had a way to solve the problem, it would cost him too much to complete it. If there was a better way, he would not mind accepting and listening to it. Yuan Chunqing knew that the crown prince was going to take over the government in advance, or rather, he was taking the initiative to take over the problem. He first looked at Li Yuanlong with an admiring gaze, then nodded and said, "Okay, then I will gather all the officials and listen to the crown prince's instructions." "Thank you, Prime Minister," Li Yuanlong replied in a respectful tone. After the crown prince entered the city, the first thing he did was to gather the important officials in the front hall of the palace to discuss important matters. All the officials of Jiaoji rushed over. None of them wanted to let go of this opportunity to show their faces. As a result, the hall that could normally only hold 50 to 60 officials was stuffed with over 100 people, making it seem very crowded. Li Yuanlong didn't have the slightest intention of chasing them away. On the contrary, he maintained a smile on his face, showing a very patient look. When almost everyone had arrived, at least no one was rushing over from the outside, he coughed lightly and attracted everyone's attention to himself. With this light cough, the hall quieted down. Then, more than 200 eyes stared at Crown Prince Li Yuanlong. They all wanted to hear what this crown prince would say and how he would resolve the predicament in front of them. Chapter 489. Everyone. After the hall fell silent, Li Yuanlong's voice was heard. "I'm sure everyone knows what kind of situation we are facing now. The mercenaries are coming with a vengeance, and they are equipped with advanced firearms that can take people's lives from hundreds of zhang away. Our army is no match for them, and we have already lost several battles. Right now, the enemy has already taken over Beatty City, which is less than 200 li away from our Jiaoji capital. At this time of crisis, I wonder if anyone has any ideas on how to retreat. After saying this, Li Yuanlong looked at the officials with anticipation. He wanted to see if there were any better ideas. After hearing the crown prince's words, the officials, who were still discussing spiritedly, fell completely silent. In fact, before the crown prince came, everyone had talked about the war in the country more than once. Huang Hua had returned. Jishu and Longbian had also sent back news, confirming that the mercenaries had a powerful killing weapon in their hands that was far beyond their imagination. It was an advanced flintlock that could fire continuously and was extremely accurate. It was said that the firearm could shoot up to 600 to 700 meters away. When it landed on a person, it could still be fatal. In comparison, the bows and arrows in their hands could only shoot up to 100 meters. When it was truly lethal, it could only shoot up to 50 to 60 meters. The difference was more than 10 times. How could they fight this war? But what could they do if they couldn't win? This was where they lived, and the mercenaries belonged to outsiders. Even if they were outsiders, they couldn't just let them do whatever they wanted, right? When the king refused to see anyone, everyone put all their hopes on the crown prince. But now that the crown prince asked this question, how could they answer? Everyone who couldn't think of a solution could only turn their attention to Li Yuanlong. In their opinion, they didn't have the ability to find a solution, but the crown prince must have a solution. No one spoke. Although this was within Li Yuanlong's expectations, he still couldn't help but let out a long sigh when he saw the outcome. Is there really no solution to this? Seeing how disappointed the crown prince was, the officials couldn't help but lower their heads. Obviously, they didn't want the crown prince to see their incompetent side. On the other hand, some of the military officials had a helpless look on their faces, but none of them lowered their heads. As generals, they were originally prepared to sacrifice their lives for the country. They were not afraid of death. After seeing that the civil officials were helpless, the generals led by the famous General Fan Yuhai stepped forward. Your Highness, we are willing to be the vanguard. Once you give the order, no one will disobey. More than a dozen generals stood up and spoke in unison. It was quite imposing. Their words caused the civil officials who had their heads lowered to tremble. It also caused Li Yuanlong, who was seated at the head of the table, to light up. No matter what, as long as there are generals who dare to fight, Jiaoji will not fall. The most important thing was that with the support of these generals, his position as the temporary commander would be stable. Good. Generals, your courage is commendable. This crown prince is very happy. Li Yuanlong's gaze fell on Fan Yuhai, Huang Hua, and the other generals as he spoke emotionally. After speaking, he shook his head. However, there is a huge disparity in the weapons of both sides. Even if the generals aren't afraid of death, this crown prince doesn't want to throw away his life. Before we can think of a better solution, we have to carefully consider whether to fight or not. Your Highness. When Fan Yuhai heard the meaning behind Li Yuanlong's words, he became anxious. He could sense that the crown prince was going to give up the battle and ask for peace. All right, this crown prince has his own plans. Where is the prime minister? Li Yuanlong interrupted Fan Yuhai's next words and swept his gaze across the officials. This old official is here. Wan Chunqing took a step forward. This crown prince orders you to represent this crown prince in negotiating with the mercenaries in Beidao City. See what they want. If they are willing to withdraw their troops, we are willing to compensate them. Are you willing to take up this task? Since he couldn't find a better solution, Li Yuanlong followed his original plan. This was going to ask for peace. Speaking of which, this wasn't a good task. As the prime minister of the country and the leader of the officials, if Wan Chunqing said he wasn't willing, no one could force him. However, after his expression changed a few times, he still nodded and agreed. Since it is the crown prince's order, this old official is willing to do it. Good, as expected of the prime minister of the country. Then I will have to trouble you. You can rest assured that the negotiation is just a method. From today onwards, we will use the power of the country to forge iron on a large scale and strive to forge more iron shields and other iron weapons. This will ensure that when the mercenaries are forced to fight, we won't be too passive. In addition, this crown prince will send people to the great Ming dynasty to present a letter of credence. I am willing to be a subject in exchange for the mercenaries' withdrawal. Your Highness the Crown Prince. Hearing this, all the officials fell to their knees one by one. Of course, they knew that everything they had today was not easy to come by. Now that Li Yuanlong had made so many concessions, they felt very wronged. However, after thinking about it, it seemed that there was no better way to resolve this crisis than this method. Sai, if you want dignity, you need to be strong enough. I hope that after this incident, everyone can work together to make Jiaoji even stronger. This way, no one will look down on us and Jiaoji in the future. Long live your Highness, the Crown Prince. Hearing Li Yuanlong's words of instruction, all the officials revealed their determination to strive for greatness. The Crown Prince saw all of this and felt very gratified. If everyone could change after this ordeal, it would be a good thing. Of course, there was one thing that Li Yuanlong would not say out loud. That was, the negotiation was just a pretense. His real goal was to use this opportunity to forge more iron weapons to fight the enemy. Being influenced by what he saw and heard since he was young, he did not believe that begging could be exchanged for peace. Only by becoming stronger would others look up to him. That was where true strength lied. Even if the enemy had such advanced firearms, with Jiaoji's current conditions, it would require too much effort to win the war. If things went wrong, the foundation of Jiaoji would be shaken. This was not something that the ambitious Li Yuanlong wanted to see. What he needed was to win this war with the smallest price. For this reason, he did not hesitate to temporarily lower his head to the great Ming dynasty in order to obtain their support. He had already asked around and found out that the enemy's general was the Duke of Loyalty. Since the Duke was conferred by the great Ming dynasty, this matter would be easy to handle. As long as the great Ming dynasty's emperor ordered him to retreat, how would the enemy dare to not retreat? When that time came, it would be time for him to launch an all-out counterattack. He might even launch a surprise attack while the enemy was retreating. If things went well, he might even be able to obtain those advanced firearms for his own use. As for whether the great Ming dynasty would do as he wished and request Yang Qindong to retreat, there was no need to think too much about this. What was the great Ming dynasty? It was a great nation. The most important thing was what others thought of them. As long as they said something nice, or even made some verbal promises, the great Ming dynasty would definitely do as they said for the sake of their reputation. This was what it meant to suffer because of their reputation. In order to gain a good reputation and a magnanimous title, countless dynasties in history had paid a heavy price for this. Even Li Yuanlong could see this point and use it to his advantage. It was clear that such a huge shortcoming hindered China's development. After the impromptu court meeting ended, Li Yuanlong found Prime Minister Wan Chunqing and told him his true purpose. Prime Minister, when you go to the mercenary camp, don't be too anxious. The negotiations can be done slowly. In this case, the people I sent to the great Ming dynasty to ask for peace will cooperate with you to deliver the good news. Rest assured. Considering the distance between Jiaoji and the great Ming dynasty, some things could not be done in a day. How to fight for time was what Wan Chunqing needed to do. After understanding the crown prince's intention, Yuan Chunsheng was very relieved. He was worried that the crown prince would be scared. If that was the case, how could he lead Jiaoji to greater heights? Fortunately, everything was just a temporary measure. A person who could adapt to circumstances like this was the true leader of Jiaoji. With a face full of admiration, Yuan Chunsheng confidently patted his chest and promised Li Yuanlong, "Your Highness, please rest assured. Once I'm here, it won't be a problem to delay for 10 to 15 days. Okay, this crown prince will order the people who go to the great Ming dynasty to ask for peace to speed up." Li Yuanlong also vowed. In general, he valued the prime minister's talent very much. Naturally, he did not want anything to happen to him. On the night after the two of them discussed, the officials who went to the great Ming dynasty to ask for peace secretly departed. On the morning of the second day, Yuan Chunsheng changed into a brand new official uniform and led a group of personal attendants out of Hanoi City. They headed straight for Beidai City, which was 200 li away. Just as the group departed, a messenger from Jiaoji rushed to Beidai City ahead of them and explained the prime minister's intentions. Beidai City. With the arrival of Yang Qindong's main forces, the city changed again. The rich people who instigated others to attack the mercenaries were all dragged out of their homes. Anyone who dared to resist or disobey was killed without mercy. Yang Qindong admitted that he did not have a good temper when it came to people of other races. This was especially so for people who wanted to stab him in the back. His hatred would not last overnight, and he would take the opportunity to settle it. Under Yang Qindong's ruthless methods and policies, more than 20 rich people were brought out of their homes. In the beginning, there was some resistance. However, after more than 60 people from 2 families were killed, the rest became obedient. When the people were arrested, they were brought out of their homes obediently. Chapter 490. The orders of those who were brought out had already been decided. Just like in Chui City, the temporary small square was filled with wooden stakes. More than 20 people were tied to the stakes one by one. Then the common people gathered. The Han people were singled out and naturally became a special class, living a life of eating and wearing warm clothes. After meeting up with Chunbo's 3 battalions, the army expanded to over 8,000 men. It was more than enough to clear out a small Beidai city. In an instant, the Han people were elated. The Jiaoji people became restless. Even when they slept at night, they didn't dare to close their eyes. They were afraid that the mercenaries would rush in and take them out to parade through the streets. It was no wonder that the people of Jiaoji were so worried. Every day, because of the Han people's accusations, some of the Jiaoji people who had bullied them in the past were dragged out of their warm beds in the middle of the night. Only the people of Jiaoji, who had always been kind to others, could truly sleep peacefully. In just 2 days, the atmosphere of the entire Beidai city changed, especially when the mercenaries announced that most of the people who were supposed to be captured had been captured. If there were no other accidents, they wouldn't disturb the lives of the commoners. Only then did the panic slowly subside. It was also at this time that news of Prime Minister Yuan Chunsheng's arrival for negotiations reached the ears of Yang Qindong. According to the news, Prime Minister Yuan would arrive at Beidai City by tomorrow afternoon at the latest. At that time, he hoped that everyone would be able to sit down peacefully for a discussion. Some of the young Xian army officers didn't agree with the Jiaoji people's request for negotiations or even submission. They believed that since the advantage was in their hands, the moment they arrived at Jiaoji, it was only natural that the country would be destroyed. But for some reason, the 6th young master actually agreed to the request for negotiations. He even said that he would welcome the other party into the city. When the news came out, many of the officers were confused. Those with bad tempers were even more upset. In other words, if the order had been given by Yang Qindong, or if it had been any other general, even Lung Song, and Gao Xiong would have been criticized. The officers did not understand this decision and were conflicted. As the political commissar of the 2nd Regiment of the Cold Front, Kong Jie immediately went to Yang Qindong and expressed his concerns. Kong Jie had a troubled look on his face. When he saw Yang Qindong, he said, "Sixth young master, regarding the negotiation with Jiaoji, the officers are quite upset. Although we can't see anything wrong with them, if we can't explain it clearly, it will affect the morale of the soldiers." Kong Jie did not come here to criticize Yang Qindong. He did not dare to do so. He was just reporting his concerns because of his duty. Regarding this, Yang Qindong could understand. He naturally had such a plan. Since Kong Jie came looking for him, it was time for him to give the officers an explanation. "All right, political commissar Kong, you don't have to be too anxious. Since this young master was the one who made the decision, I have my reasons. How about this? Inform all the officers and instructors of the various battalions to come for a meeting. This young master has something to say." Seeing that Yang Qindong wanted to personally explain the matter to everyone, Kong Jie was overjoyed. He immediately said, "This subordinate will inform them right away." In less than an hour, all the battalion commanders and instructors of the same rank in the city arrived at the general's residence. This used to be Pan Wenfei's residence, but he was now dead. Naturally, this place became Yang Qindong's temporary residence. More than 30 battalion commanders rushed over and stood orderly in the courtyard. Their eyes were fixed on Yang Qindong, who was looking up at the sky. This scene had been going on for quite a while. It was Yang Qindong who called them over, but the 6th young master did not say a word. He only looked up at the sky. Naturally, no one dared to rush him. They could only stand in standard military posture and straighten their bodies. After about the time it took to drink a cup of tea, Yang Qindong slowly lowered his head. To be honest, it was uncomfortable to look up at the sky for a long time. However, in order to remind these officers, there were some things that had to be done. It was a good thing that the officers could have their own opinions. However, if they dared to question the decision of their superior, they would not be allowed to do so. For example, a platoon commander only saw the soldiers of his platoon. That was bound to have limitations. A company commander only saw a company, unlike a battalion commander who could see the bigger picture. As the actual founder of the mercenary army, as well as the highest leader, Yang Qindong naturally saw the bigger picture. In order to accomplish this, it was inevitable that he would make some concessions. For example, allowing the Prime Minister of Jiaoji to negotiate was influenced by the bigger picture. As the territory grew larger in the future, the chances of something like this happening would also increase. He could not possibly explain it to his subordinates every single time. This time could be an exception, but it would only be limited to this one time. Through this incident, Yang Qindong wanted to tell everyone that they could doubt his decision, but they had to obey. Otherwise, they could just go back to wherever they wanted to go. There were no three-legged toads, but there were plenty of two-legged toads. Seeing that the time it took for an incense stick to burn had passed, and the emotions of the officers had calmed down, Yang Qindong finally spoke. "I don't care what you think of yourselves. I don't care what kind of dissatisfaction or opinions you have in your hearts. Right now, this young master wants to ask you all one question. With our current strength, can we take down all of Jiaoji's cities without shedding any blood?" Without shedding any blood, hearing Yang Qindong's words, all of the officers shook their heads in unison. In terms of brute force, there were no cities in Jiaoji that they could not take down. However, it was impossible for them to take down a city without using a single shot. Seeing that all of the officers were shaking their heads, Yang Qindong snorted coldly. A sharp glint flashed across his eyes. Since you can't do this, what right do you have to be arrogant? Why can't you have a proper discussion with the other party's envoy? Don't tell me that you want to show off your strength and disregard the safety of the Han civilians? Under the harsh criticism, the faces of some of the officers turned ugly. They only considered that their military strength was already very strong. The defense of Beatty City was the best example. Since they already had the initiative, why did they still have to negotiate? Wasn't this like a blind man lighting a lamp? However, when they heard Yang Qindong's questioning, they realized that such a rash action would cause the deaths of all the Han civilians in Jiaoji. Since they could slaughter their way into the various cities of Jiaoji, why couldn't the other party wipe out all the Han civilians in the city before they arrived? If that was the case, even if they killed the civilians, what would they gain? They were nothing more than empty cities with nothing to show for it. This was not their initial strategic goal. They wanted to open up another base here, not just to show off their tyrannical military strength. It could be said that when Yang Qindong said those words, many of the officers understood what was going on. They thought about how they were just ordinary civilians not long ago, living in an abyss of suffering. If it wasn't for the sixth young master who saved them, gave them authority, and gave them the most advanced firearms, some of them would have been dead by now. Most of them were still running around just to fill their stomachs. Where did the morale and drive come from? The officers who had figured everything out lowered their heads one by one. They were reflecting on their wrong thoughts. Seeing that the officers understood his intentions so quickly, Yang Qindong's expression turned slightly better. All right, I've explained everything to you. If anyone is still dissatisfied with the negotiations with Jiaoji, feel free to voice it out. However, if you don't have any objections now, you are not allowed to discuss this matter when you return. Otherwise, I'll fire every single one of you. I won't care what contributions you've made in the past. When that time comes, don't say that I, the sixth young master, won't be merciful. No, the sixth young master is wise. A wave of awe sounded from below. It was no wonder that these officers were able to think things through so quickly. Previously, they were limited by their foresight, and their thoughts were limited as well. Now that they knew that the sixth young master was thinking for the sake of the Han people, how could the officers who used to be part of him not understand? Meeting adjourned, if you've thought things through. If you have time, train more and help the people in the city. It's better than letting your imagination run wild every day. Yang Qindong waved his hand casually, and the courtyard, which was filled with people, was emptied in an instant. Other than the fact that Yang Qindong was the sixth young master, he was able to pacify the officers so quickly because he was thinking for the sake of the Han people. Did you think he wanted to negotiate with them? However, if he didn't do so and forced Jiaoji into a corner, they would vent their anger on the Han people within their borders. By then, it wouldn't just be one or two people dying. Both the information from the Security Bureau and the words of the surrendered Hong Jin proved that out of the less than 3 million people in Jiaoji, there were at least 200,000 Han people. That was a ratio of 1 in 15. If all these Han people were killed, it would be a huge loss to the Han people. More importantly, many of these people had lived here since young. They had feelings for this place and knew how to build it. If a new batch of people were to come, they would have to adapt to this place all over again, and that would take up a lot of time. Right now, what Yang Qindong lacked the most was manpower and time. After all, the world was so big, who knew how many years it would take to conquer it all? Chapter 4:91. There were some things that could only be done as quickly as possible. In this way, whether or not the Han people in Jiaoji could survive, and how many of them could survive would be directly related to the issue of ruling over this place. After convincing these officers, they would go and convince the platoon officers, and the entire army would become stable again. At noon on the second day, a group of 200 people arrived at the west side of Beidai City. Yuan Chunqing arrived at Beidai City 4 hours earlier than planned, and it was enough to show their sincerity and anxiousness. They were afraid that the mercenaries would attack the other cities again, so they rushed over without stopping to rest. When Yuan Chunqing arrived at the city, according to the plan, 2nd Regiment Commander Luo Pe and Political Commissar Kong Jie went out to welcome them and led them into Beidai City. Trying his best to maintain a smile, Yuan Chunqing greeted Luo Pe and Kong Jie before asking about Yang Qindong. "May I know where the Duke of Loyalty is? This time, this Prime Minister is under the orders of the Crown Prince to bring some gifts." The Duke of Loyalty is still inspecting the army. If Prime Minister Yuan is anxious, why don't you take a look with us? Political Commissar Kong Jie first smiled at Luo Pe, then turned to Yuan Chunqing and said in an unhurried tone, "All of this was planned." Yuan Chunqing was anxious to see Yang Qindong and test his intentions, so he wanted to use this opportunity to give him a good beating and let him see the morale and momentum of the mercenaries. When he heard that Yang Qindong was inspecting the army, a bitter expression flashed across Yuan Chunqing's face. To be able to become the prime minister, which one of them was an idiot? How could he not understand the meaning behind this? This was clearly a show of strength. But when he thought about it, he also wanted to use this opportunity to see the strength of the mercenaries. As the saying goes, only by knowing yourself and your enemy can you win 100 battles. Yuan Chunqing agreed. Then I will have to trouble the two generals. Under Luo Pe and Kong Jie's lead, they arrived at the northernmost part of the city. This was originally a trading market, but now it was occupied by the mercenaries as a temporary military camp. When they saw the temporary wooden fences from afar, they heard a neat battle cry. As the prime minister of the Jiaoji nation, Yuan Chunqing had seen all kinds of situations. He had even entered the military camp of Jiaoji countless times. However, this was the first time he had heard such a unified voice. He hadn't even seen anyone yet, but just from these deafening voices, he knew how high the morale of the mercenaries was. Yuan Chunqing's face changed slightly, which was noticed by Political Commissar Kong Jie, who was observing him from the side. Then he made a gesture of invitation with a smile. "Prime Minister Yuan, don't you want to see the Duke of Loyalty? He's inside, please." "All right, please, let's go together." Yuan Chunqing forcefully suppressed the fear in his heart and said with a forced smile. There was an entire platoon of Lung Feng on duty at the entrance of the barracks. Although it seemed that there was no problem with the security of Beidai City, this place had just been recovered, so it was necessary to be vigilant. The platoon leader in charge of the guards at the entrance was Lu Jian. He was from Mount Qishan of Ryukyu Island. A while ago, he was caught by the imperial guards at the Songru shop in Gaozhou Prefecture of the Southern Ming dynasty. After passing the test, he didn't say a word about the mercenaries. A while ago, he made a military contribution in the defense of Beidai City and was promoted from an auxiliary platoon leader to a platoon leader of Lung Feng. This time, he was in charge of leading the platoon. When he saw the regiment commander and political commissar walking over with a group of people dressed in Jiaoji attire, he raised his right hand with a wooden expression and said loudly, "Any outsiders who want to enter the barracks are not allowed to carry weapons. Please remove your weapons." Yuan Chunqing's face turned ugly when he heard Lu Jian's words. If the mercenaries wanted to deal with him, it should be very easy. However, at least they had weapons on them, so they still had a trace of resistance. But if even their weapons were confiscated, then wouldn't they become fish on the chopping board? Wouldn't they be at the mercy of others? Yuan Chunqing didn't agree immediately. The guards beside him stepped forward and pulled out their swords, shouting, "Who dares to confiscate our weapons? We are here to negotiate as representatives of the Jiaoji army, not prisoners of a defeated army." HM? Lu Jian narrowed his eyes and turned around to look at the row of Lung Feng's soldiers behind him. The Lung Feng soldiers laughed out loud. Since he dared to use his saber in front of them, it just so happened that they hadn't fought for 2 days. It was a good opportunity to warm up. Seeing that Yuan Chunqing had unsheathed his saber, his opponents in military green camouflage uniforms laughed instead of getting angry. Yuan Chunqing's bodyguards' expressions turned ugly. This mission wasn't easy. If they didn't handle it well, they would be in danger of dying. Everyone was already mentally prepared for this. However, if they could avoid death, it would be best if they didn't die. But now that the situation had come to this, they didn't know what to do for a moment. They could only look at Yuan Chunqing with troubled gazes and wait for the Prime Minister to speak. Yuan Chunqing's expression didn't look any better. Although he was a little angry at the arrogance of the mercenaries who wanted to confiscate his weapons as soon as they met, he was here to negotiate, not to surrender. However, he hated his guards even more. How could they pull out their swords without an order? If they angered the mercenaries, not only would they fail the negotiation, but they would also lose their lives here. Death. Of course, Yuan Chunqing was afraid. However, he was also afraid that he wouldn't be able to complete the mission given to him by the Crown Prince. Therefore, when he saw the inquisitive looks from the guards, he turned to Luo Pe and Kong Jie and said, "Generals, we are guests after all. A host should treat his guests well." Seeing how thick-skinned Yuan Chunqing was, Political Commissar Kong Jie spoke up before Luo Pe could say anything. "Apologies, we didn't invite you here. Even if you are a guest, you have to follow the host's rules." The moment he finished speaking, Yuan Chunqing's expression turned ugly. This time, they were the ones who initiated the negotiation. In other words, they were the weaker party. It was difficult for them to be treated with respect. Without looking at Yuan Chunqing's expression, Kong Jie's eyes fell on Lu Jian. Although he didn't say anything, his meaning was very clear. He wanted Lu Jian to do whatever he wanted, regardless of the fact that they were here. Lu Jian was a smart person to be able to become the platoon leader of the Cold Vanguard platoon. Seeing that the regiment commander and the political commissar had nothing else to say, he chuckled with a sinister look on his face. He raised his right hand and said to the 30 soldiers behind him, "Brothers, someone dares to show off his weapon in front of us, Cold Edge. What do you think we should do?" "What else can we do?" "Teach him a lesson." The 30 Cold Vanguard platoon members were already itching for a fight. Now that they received their platoon leader's order, they knew what to do. Each of them smiled as they took out shiny bayonets from their waists and equipped them with the 95-style spearhead. Not using bullets was already a form of respect for the Jiaoji guards. Otherwise, the battle would have ended before the fight even started. The 30 soldiers equipped with the 95-style spearhead smiled as they surrounded Yuan Chunqing. However, even though they were smiling, their formation wasn't messed up at all. Instead, they formed a ring-shaped formation. In just a few breaths, more than 30 of Yuan Chunqing's guards were tightly surrounded. Seeing that the enemy was approaching, the guards gripped their bayonets tightly. Then, the captain of the guards asked Yuan Chunqing for instructions. "Since you are all young and are part of the military, a proper spar can improve everyone's relationship. However, you must remember that your subordinates must know their limits. There must be no deaths." Yuan Chunqing could see that this battle was inevitable. However, he didn't want anyone to die. Otherwise, the negotiation would fail. That was why he reminded the captain of the guards, Speaking of which, as the Prime Minister of Jiaoji, Wan Chuanqing's guards were naturally skilled. In a one-on-one battle with cold weapons, he couldn't think of any possibility of failure. After Wan Chuanqing gave the order, the captain of the guards nodded immediately. Then he said to the guards beside him, "Master said that no one can die. You must act appropriately." "All right." All the guards nodded in unison. However, compared to the cold vanguard platoon members who were orderly and gave the same command, these people's answers were more scattered. Seeing that the Jiaoji guards were ready, Lu Jian also pulled out the bayonet from his waist and inserted it into the 95-style spearhead. Then he said, "Team up with 3 people. Kill." When the word kill was uttered, the 30 cold vanguard platoon members' expressions changed. If it was said that there was still a hint of playfulness in their eyes just a moment ago, now all of them were much more focused. This was also due to Yang Qindong's usual teachings. In his words, mercy to the enemy was cruelty to the reader. Therefore, no matter what the situation was, as long as they fought, no matter how strong or weak the opponent was, they had to give it their all. This was the only way to ensure that they could unleash their full strength and not fail miserably. Under such teachings, the 30 cold vanguard platoon members' expressions turned serious when the word kill was uttered. It could be seen that they were in teams of 3 and quickly gathered together to form a team. They had undergone this training countless times. They were so familiar with it that the Jiaoji guards only saw a blur in front of their eyes. Suddenly, there were 3 enemies in front of them. Moreover, the 3 of them were back to back. After a rough look, it seemed like there were no openings for them to attack from. No matter which direction they attacked from, they would have to face the combined attacks of the 3 people. Chapter 492. This was the first time the guards saw this 3-3 formation, and they were at a loss of what to do. However, even though they were at a loss, it didn't mean that the cold vanguards would wait for an opportunity. Seeing their opponents' confused expressions, the 10 groups of cold vanguards launched their own fierce attacks. The dazzling white bayonets were everywhere. In just the blink of an eye, at least a dozen guards had been pierced by the bayonets and fell to the ground with a look of helplessness on their faces. Lu Jian also faced Wan Chuanqing's guard captain with his bayonet. The only difference was that they were fighting one-on-one. The guard captain held a large machete in his hand. He was also tall and burly. In comparison, Lu Jian, who was only 1.78 meters tall, was at least half a head shorter than the guard captain. In terms of size, Lu Jian seemed to be at a disadvantage. This gave the guard captain a natural advantage, and he thought that Lu Jian couldn't withstand a single blow. However, just as this kind of underestimation was formed, a bayonet suddenly pierced towards his face. The guard captain's expression changed drastically. This kind of fierce attack made him lose focus for a moment, and then he instinctively raised his machete to block. Clang! Under the short exchange of weapons, the bayonet and machete clashed for a moment. Then, the bayonet that was knocked to the right suddenly turned around and stabbed towards the guard captain's waist. This move was so fast that it didn't seem to be a helpless move at all. It gave people the feeling that it was long prepared. To be able to become Wan Chuanqing's trusted guard captain, his skills were naturally extraordinary. In order to obtain this position, he had competed for a long time and defeated many opponents. Therefore, even though the dagger was as fast as lightning, the captain still managed to dodge it at the last moment with a twist of his waist. This made Wan Chuanqing, who was watching everything from the side, sigh in relief. Just as he thought that Lu Jian's attack was over, and it should be his guard captain's turn to counterattack, the bayonet suddenly turned around and left a bright red wound on the guard captain's waist. Hiss! After the sharp bayonet cut through his waist, the guard captain felt a burst of pain. His face couldn't help but twist and become a little terrifying. He had calculated everything, but he had never considered the uniqueness of the bayonet. It wasn't like a spear that could only stab. It wasn't like a saber that could only slash. It wasn't like a sword that could only stab. It wasn't like a sword that could only stab and slash. On the contrary, this bayonet could be used to stab, chop, whip, chop, and flick. It could be used to its fullest potential and could form an extremely effective killing force. As such, when faced with such a weapon, if one were to view it as an ordinary weapon, it was inevitable that one would suffer a loss. Just like this time, the whipping stance left a bloody wound on his waist. As blood continued to drip from the wound, the guard captain felt that his reflexes and strength were gradually losing. The 30 or so guards were in the same situation as the head of the guards, or perhaps even worse. In front of the 3-to-3 battle formation, in front of the seemingly omnipotent bayonet, none of the guards could withstand a single blow from them. Often, the guards with some skills could block one bayonet attack, but the next bayonet would fly over, making it impossible to guard against and impossible to dodge. The moment Lu Jian injured the captain of the guards, the battle on this side had already ended. None of the 30 or so guards could stand. All of them were lying on the ground with injuries all over their bodies. This was because the Lung Feng soldiers didn't intend to kill and intentionally held back. If this was a real battlefield, it wouldn't be just 30 or so injured that were lying on the ground, but 30 or so corpses. Enough. Wan Chuanqing's expression turned extremely ugly when he saw that the guards he was so proud of were all defeated in such a short period of time. He was afraid that more of his men would be injured or killed if this went on. Thus, he roared loudly. When the country's prime minister put on a stern face, he naturally had an intimidating aura. Unfortunately, this aura was nothing in the eyes of Luo Pe and Kong Jie. On the contrary, the latter said in a mocking tone, "What's wrong? Prime Minister Wan, are you afraid? Hee, if you are, you can go back to Hanoi City now and regroup. We will see who wins and who loses on the battlefield." He was obviously trying to provoke Wan Chuanqing. How could Wan Chuanqing respond? Although he was a little annoyed that his guards didn't give him face, he wouldn't forget what his mission was. Next, he pretended that he didn't hear anything and said, "Generals, I'm here to see the Duke of Loyalty. Please lead the way. The Duke of Loyalty is in the barracks, but you can't bring any weapons in." Kong Jie reminded with a smile. This old man understands. This time, Wan Chuanqing was straightforward. He reached out and took off the sword on his waist, which was used as an ornament, and handed it to a guard behind him who had just gotten up. Then he said to the head guard, "Put down your weapon and follow this old man in." Wan Chuanqing's cooperation made Kong Jie speechless. In his heart, he sighed at Wan Chuanqing's flexibility. He signaled Commander Luo Pe with his eyes. After seeing the other party nod in agreement, he smiled and said to Wan Chuanqing, "Prime Minister Wan, please." A fight broke out suddenly and ended quickly. In the end, Lung Feng won. Of course, Lung Feng had the advantage of being equipped with a bayonet, but more importantly, it was because of their cooperation. In other words, Lung Feng was Lung Feng. Even if he fought with cold weapons one-on-one, or even one against many, he was still able to win. When they finally stepped into the barracks, they saw 5 guards every 3 steps and a sentry every 5 steps. These guards were all Lung Feng. Their training was basically over. What they needed to improve was their killing techniques and proficiency on the battlefield. Therefore, whenever Yang Qindong had the time, he would train the auxiliary soldiers and temporary auxiliary soldiers. Since they had the advantage in numbers, once they improved their battle prowess, it would be a huge boost to the overall battle prowess of the entire army. Under the guidance of Luo Pe and political commissar Kong Jie, Prime Minister Wan Chunqing led the head guard, who had a piece of white cloth wrapped around his waist, into the depths of the barracks. From afar, he saw a wide training field. There were thousands of soldiers practicing all kinds of drills. Some were practicing formation, some were practicing assassination, and some were practicing target shooting. There were also some huge logs placed there for a few people to hold together to train their strength. All in all, Wan Chunqing had never seen such a training method before. All of this gave him a sense of novelty. It was as if Granny Lu had entered the Grand View Garden. When he walked in front of a group of soldiers who were practicing walking under the slogan, 1, 2, 1, Wan Chunqing was very curious. He couldn't help but ask Luo Pe and Kong Jie beside him, "Generals, why are they practicing walking?" Of course, the two regimental officers wouldn't tell him the various benefits of proper formation training. They only smiled and pointed at a young man who was also dressed in camouflage clothing not far away. "That's the Duke of Loyalty. Let's go over." Oh. When he heard that Yang Qindong was right in front of him, Wan Chunqing set aside his curiosity and strode over to where Yang Qindong was. As he walked forward, his expression constantly changed. When he felt that the smile on his face was enough, he maintained this expression and walked over to Yang Qindong. "Duke, the Prime Minister of Jiaoji is here." Kong Jie's voice rang out respectfully and spread forward. Yang Qindong, who was watching the training on the field, didn't change his expression. It was as if he didn't hear Kong Jie at all, and continued doing what he was supposed to do. After Kong Jie reported again, he didn't say anything else. He believed that the sixth young master must have heard what he said, but he didn't reply. There must be a reason why Kong Jie didn't ask anymore. Wan Chunqing, who was originally smiling, stood there awkwardly. A full quarter of an hour passed. During this time, Yang Qindong said something to a few of the officers beside him. He pointed out many problems with the soldiers' training, but he didn't say a word to them. He didn't even turn his head to look at them. This made Wan Chunqing's expression turn even uglier. If it wasn't for Crown Prince Li Yuanlong's voice in his mind, he would have probably left in a huff. Ahem. In the end, he had to fight for the opportunity himself. After adjusting his mentality, Wan Chunqing decided to speak up himself. Although it was embarrassing enough, it was better than standing there all the time. "Your Excellency, I am the Prime Minister of Jiaoji Nation, Wan Chunqing. I am here on the orders of my Crown Prince to pay my respects." Wan Chunqing's voice wasn't soft. He shouted with qi in his dantian, so it was impossible for anyone not to hear him. In the end, Yang Qindong finally turned his head. Yang Qindong finally moved. Wan Chunqing wanted to take this opportunity to say something, but before he could speak, the ridiculously young Duke of Jiaoji spoke first. "Are you the Prime Minister of Chiha from Jiaoji? Since we are here to talk business, where is Hong Jin? I will leave this matter to you." 2 meters behind Yang Qindong stood the captive general of Jiaoji, Hong Jin. He was here to observe how the mercenaries trained under Yang Qindong's permission. According to the sixth young master's intention, Jiaoji would have its own army in the future, and the commander of this army would most likely be handed over to Hong Jin. When Hong Jin first heard this news, he was extremely excited. He originally surrendered to save his life, but now he really wanted to serve under Yang Qindong. It was as if he had the opportunity to come to the training ground. He stared at everything without blinking. He only wanted to learn the mercenaries' training methods so that he could form a strong army in the future. You're tuning in to the Mystic Fist YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.